A woman steps off a stagecoach into Texas dust, walks straight into a stable she was forbidden to enter, and within an hour discovers the theft that's been bleeding a ranch dry for months. The rancher who built his entire life on 3 iron rules about women just watched a stranger in a travel-stained dress break every single one before lunch. What happens when the man who trusts no one meets the woman who sees everything he's tried to hide? This is their story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet, but Silas Crowley was already 2 hours into his day. That's how it worked on a ranch. The animals didn't care if you'd slept, didn't give a damn about the nightmares that still woke you at 3 in the morning with your dead brother's face fresh in your mind. The work existed whether you were ready for it or not. He stood in the main paddock, one boot propped on the lower rail of the fence, watching his foreman direct 3 ranch hands through the morning feed. The horses knew the routine better than the men did. Silas had built this place from nothing after the war, bought it with money he'd saved and blood he'd rather forget. 15 years of brutal work had turned scrubland into something that mattered, something that was his. The rules had come later, after he'd learned the hard way what happened when you let your guard down. Marcus, his foreman of 8 years, called out instructions in that easy drawl that made men listen without feeling ordered around. Good at his job, reliable. Silas didn't trust easily, but Marcus had earned it through consistency and hard work. The kind of man who showed up before dawn and never complained about the conditions. Boss? One of the younger hands, Tommy, jogged over from the barn. Stagecoach coming up the road. Wasn't expecting any deliveries today. Silas straightened, squinting toward the dust cloud rising in the distance. He wasn't expecting anyone, hadn't ordered supplies. His brother James had handled all the ordering before the fever took him 3 months back, and since then Silas had been running everything himself, learning as he went. The books were a mess, but he'd get to them eventually. Probably got the wrong ranch, he muttered, but something in his gut didn't settle right. The stagecoach pulled up near the main house, and the driver hopped down to open the door. Silas started walking that direction, Marcus falling into step beside him. They were halfway across the yard when a woman stepped down from the coach, and Silas stopped dead. She wasn't young, maybe 35, 40, tall, with dark hair pinned back severe and practical. She wore a blue dress that had probably looked respectable when she'd started her journey, but now it was covered in the kind of dust that came from days on rough roads. She had one small trunk and a leather satchel that she held like it contained something more valuable than gold. The driver set her trunk down and tipped his hat. "Ma'am, you sure this is the right place?" "Crowley Ranch." Her voice was clear, educated, northern accent, probably Boston or somewhere close. "Yes, ma'am." "Then this is correct. Thank you." Silas approached slowly, Marcus right behind him. The woman turned to face them, and he got his first good look at her eyes, sharp, taking in everything. The kind of eyes that missed nothing, that calculated and measured in the space of a heartbeat. "Can I help you?" Silas kept his voice level, neutral. "Mr. Crowley?" She didn't wait for confirmation. "My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm the financial auditor your brother hired before his death. I apologize for the delay in my arrival. There were complications with the railroad schedule." The words hit him like a fist to the chest. "What?" "Your brother James Crowley contracted my services approximately 4 months ago. He sent a letter expressing concern about discrepancies in the ranch accounts and requested a comprehensive audit." She reached into her satchel and produced a folded letter. "I have his correspondence here if you need verification." Silas took the letter, recognizing his brother's handwriting immediately. The date was from early February, 2 weeks before James had taken ill. The content was exactly what she'd described: formal, concerned, asking for professional help reviewing the finances. "James never mentioned this. Perhaps he intended to tell you after securing my agreement. The letter suggests he wanted the matter handled discreetly." Evelyn looked past him toward the ranch buildings, her gaze sweeping across the layout with professional assessment. "I understand this is unexpected, Mr. Crowley, but I've traveled a considerable distance. Might we discuss the arrangement somewhere less exposed to the elements?" Marcus cleared his throat. "Boss, you want me to—" "No?" Silas folded the letter, his mind racing. An auditor. James had hired a damn auditor, and worse, a woman who was apparently planning to dig through their private business, their accounts, everything. Miss Hart, I appreciate you coming all this way, but there's been a misunderstanding. My brother's death changes things. We're managing fine without outside help. Her expression didn't change. Are you? Excuse me? Managing fine. Are you? She tilted her head slightly. Because from what your brother described in his letters, yes, there were multiple exchanges. The accounts were in significant disarray even before his illness. 3 months of additional neglect would typically compound such problems, not resolve them. Heat crawled up Silas's neck. Ma'am, I don't know how things work back east, but out here, mathematics works the same everywhere, Mr. Crowley. Her tone remained perfectly polite, but there was steel underneath. As does theft. The word hung in the air like gunsmoke. What did you say? Your brother suspected someone was stealing from the ranch. That's why he contacted me. He didn't have proof, but the numbers weren't adding up. Money was disappearing in ways that normal operations couldn't explain. Evelyn met his stare without flinching. I'm very good at finding where missing money goes. Silas was aware of Marcus shifting his weight beside him, of Tommy and the other hands pretending not to listen from across the yard. This woman had been here less than 5 minutes and had already said the one thing guaranteed to cause chaos. Those are serious accusations. They're your brother's concerns, not mine. I'm simply here to determine if they have merit. She glanced toward the house again. As I said, I've traveled quite far. If you're refusing my services, I'll need to make arrangements for the return journey. But I should mention that your brother paid half my fee in advance. The contract stipulates that I complete the work unless you formally terminate the agreement, in which case the advance is non-refundable, and you'll still owe the balance for my travel expenses. Marcus whistled low. She's got you there, boss. Silas shot him a look that could have melted horseshoes. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd spent years avoiding, strangers on his property. Someone, especially a woman, getting involved in ranch business. Questions being asked about things that should stay private. But if James had suspected theft, his brother had been the careful one, the one who paid attention to details while Silas focused on the land and livestock. If James had been worried enough to hire an auditor, there was probably a good reason. How long? Silas asked finally. To complete a thorough audit? Given the size of the operation and the time frame in question, I'd estimate 2 to 3 weeks, possibly longer if the records are particularly disorganized. And you need access to what exactly? All financial records for the past 18 months. Purchase orders, sales receipts, payroll documentation, supply invoices, bank statements if available. Any correspondence related to business transactions. I'll also need to interview key personnel about ranch operations to verify that documented expenses match actual practices. Silas felt the familiar weight of a decision he didn't want to make settling onto his shoulders. Every instinct told him to send her back to wherever she came from. But James's letter was real, and James had been smart about these things. There are rules on this ranch, Miss Hart. Something flickered across her face. Not quite amusement, but close. I'm sure there are. I'm serious. This is a working cattle operation, not some Eastern finishing school. We do things a certain way out here. I would expect nothing less. He studied her for another long moment, looking for signs of the delicate sensibilities that would make this whole situation impossible. She looked back at him with the calm patience of someone who'd spent her entire life waiting for men to finish making their points. Fine, he said, against his better judgment. You can do your audit, but you follow my rules, no arguments, no exceptions. First rule, you stay out of the stables. That's where the hands bunk, and I won't have complications because you wandered somewhere you shouldn't. Understood. Second, you don't give orders to my men. You need something. You ask me or Marcus here. Chain of command exists for a reason. Of course. Third, the books stay on ranch property. You work in the house where I can keep track of what's happening. No taking documents off-site. No making copies for some fancy Boston firm. I work alone, Mr. Crowley. I have no associates to share information with. Marcus stepped forward. I'll get her trunk to the house, boss. Guest room still set up? It wasn't, actually. They hadn't had guests since James died, but Silas nodded anyway. Make it work. Come on then, Miss Hart. Marcus reached for her trunk. I'll show you where you'll be staying. Actually, Evelyn said, her attention shifting past them both. Before settling in, I'd like to see where the ranch records are currently kept. Best to begin work immediately while the afternoon light is good. Tomorrow's soon enough, Silas said. Today is better. She wasn't arguing, just stating fact. The sooner I begin, the sooner I finish and leave your property. She had a point, and they both knew it. Silas gestured toward the main house, a sprawling structure he and James had built room by room as the ranch prospered. Office is on the right. Records are in there, such as they are. Such as they are, she repeated. How encouraging. They walked toward the house, Marcus trailing behind with the trunk. Silas could feel the eyes of every ranch hand watching this strange procession. By sunset, the whole territory would know Silas Crowley had a woman on his property, living in his house, going through his private business. The gossip alone would be enough to make him regret this decision. The office was exactly as James had left it. Papers stacked on every surface, ledgers piled in corners, receipts stuffed into drawers without any organization system. Silas had meant to clean it up, had told himself every day for 3 months that tomorrow he'd sort through everything. Tomorrow never seemed to come. Evelyn stood in the doorway, surveying the chaos with an expression Silas couldn't quite read. "Well," she said after a long pause, "I see why your brother requested assistance. James got sick fast. Didn't have time to organize before—" The words stuck in his throat. "Before he died" felt too raw to say out loud, even now. "I understand." Her voice softened slightly, the first real hint of compassion since she'd arrived. "I'll begin by creating an inventory of what's here. That alone will take most of today. I'll need a work table cleared and adequate lighting. We have lamps. Sunlight is preferable for this kind of detailed work. Lamplight causes eye strain and makes it easier to miss important details." She was already moving into the room, setting her satchel on the one chair that wasn't covered in papers. Marcus appeared with her trunk, looking uncertain about where to put it. "Guest room is upstairs, second door on the left," Silas told him. "Get it settled, then meet me in the south pasture. We've got fence work to finish before the afternoon heat sets in." "You're leaving?" Evelyn turned from her examination of the nearest ledger stack. "I've got a ranch to run, Miss Hart. You said you wanted to start immediately, so start. I'll be back for supper." He left before she could respond, Marcus following him out. They didn't speak until they were well clear of the house, halfway to where the horses were waiting. "Boss, you sure about this?" Marcus kept his voice low. "Woman alone in the house, going through all those papers. She's right about one thing. James was worried. He wouldn't have hired her without good reason." Silas swung up into his saddle, the familiar leather creaking under his weight. "Keep the men away from the house unless they have specific business there. Last thing we need is complications." "You think there's really something wrong with the money?" "I don't know, but we're about to find out." They worked through the afternoon repairing fence line in the brutal Texas heat. Hard physical labor that let Silas avoid thinking about the woman currently dissecting 3 years of his and James's work. By the time they headed back, the sun was starting its slow descent toward the horizon, painting everything gold and orange. The house looked different somehow, though Silas couldn't pinpoint what had changed. He stabled his horse and walked to the main entrance, boots heavy on the porch boards. Inside, he found Evelyn exactly where he'd left her, except now the office looked like a tornado had reorganized it. Papers were spread across every surface in what appeared to be deliberate groups. She'd moved furniture, creating a workspace that took up most of the room. 3 different ledgers lay open in front of her, and she was making notes in a small journal with rapid, precise handwriting. She looked up as he entered, and Silas noticed the smudge of ink on her cheek, the wisp of hair that had escaped her severe bun. "Mr. Crowley, good timing, actually. I have questions." "I'm sure you do." "Your supply orders from last fall, specifically October through December. The invoices indicate purchases of feed grain in quantities that seem excessive for your livestock count. Can you explain the discrepancy?" Silas moved closer, looking at the paper she indicated. Numbers swam in front of his eyes. He'd never been good with this part of ranching. That had been James's territory. "We bought extra before winter, standard practice." "Yes, but the standard calculation would be approximately 40% less than what you actually purchased. Where did the excess go?" "Stored in the barn." "All of it?" He frowned. "Far as I know." She made another note. "I'll need to verify the current inventory against these purchase records. Also, your payroll documentation is incomplete. Several months show payments to ranch hands whose names don't appear in earlier or later records. Were these temporary workers? Probably. We hire extra help during cattle drives, spring branding, that kind of thing. But you don't keep consistent records of who works when. Marcus handles hiring. You'd have to ask him about specific dates and names. I will. She returned her attention to the ledgers, already moving on to whatever calculation occupied her mind next. Silas stood there feeling useless in his own office, watching this stranger unravel months of work with the kind of focus he usually only saw in predators tracking prey. It was unsettling as hell. "I'll be in the kitchen," he said finally. "There's food if you're hungry." "Not yet. I want to finish cataloging the 1881 records before dark." He left her to it, too tired to argue. In the kitchen, he found cold biscuits and leftover stew that had seen better days. He ate standing up, watching through the window as the last light faded from the sky. When he passed the office again on his way upstairs, Evelyn was lighting lamps, squinting at a page of figures that looked identical to every other page on the desk. She didn't notice him watching. Completely absorbed in her work, mouth moving slightly as she added numbers in her head. Silas went to bed wondering what the hell James had set in motion by hiring this woman. He got his answer at dawn. The scream came from the direction of the stables, cutting through the early morning quiet like a knife. Silas was out of bed and running before his brain fully registered the sound, grabbing his rifle from beside the door out of pure instinct. He hit the yard at a dead sprint, Marcus emerging from the bunkhouse at the same moment. They converged on the stables together, Silas's heart hammering against his ribs. Inside, he found Evelyn Hart standing in front of Ranger's stall, both hands pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. And she was absolutely not supposed to be there. "What the hell are you doing in here?" Silas's voice came out harder than he intended, fear translating to anger in the space of a heartbeat. "I told you the stables were off limits." Evelyn spun to face him, and he saw that she wasn't scared. She was furious. "Your horse is dying," she said, each word clipped and precise. "And whoever is responsible for his care is either criminally negligent or actively trying to kill him." "What?" She pointed into the stall where Ranger stood, the big bay gelding that had been Silas's primary mount for 6 years. "Look at his left foreleg. Actually, look." Silas moved closer, Marcus right behind him. At first, he didn't see anything wrong. Ranger looked like he always did, calm, steady, waiting for his morning feed. "I don't see the swelling above the fetlock, the heat in the joint, the way he's not putting full weight on that leg even standing still." Evelyn's voice shook slightly. "How long has he been favoring that side?" Silas looked again, and this time he saw it. The slight puffiness in Ranger's lower leg, barely visible but definitely there. The subtle shift in how the horse distributed his weight. His stomach dropped. "Tommy's been handling him this week," Marcus said quietly. "Kid's still learning." "This isn't a learning mistake." Evelyn crouched down, pointing without touching. "See the angle of the hoof? Someone's been trimming it wrong, putting uneven pressure on the leg. Combined with what looks like consistent overwork based on the muscle tension in his shoulder, you're looking at a developing bowed tendon. Another week of this, and he'll be permanently lamed." Silas stared at her. "How do you know about horses?" "My father bred them. I grew up in stables, Mr. Crowley. I can manage a ledger book, but I learned to spot a bad leg before I could read." She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "You need a farrier immediately, complete rest for this animal, and a serious conversation with whoever's responsible for his care." Marcus was already moving. "I'll get Tommy." "Wait." Silas held up a hand, his mind racing through implications he didn't want to face. "You said someone's been trimming wrong. Tommy's green, but he knows better than to mess with hooves he's not trained for. We pay a farrier to come through twice a month." "When was the last visit?" "Should have been last week." "And was it?" Silas looked at Marcus, who'd gone very still. "Boss, I'll have to check the schedule. Been so busy with the fence work, I might have lost track." "The farrier's visits would be documented expenses," Evelyn interrupted. "They weren't in the recent records. In fact, the last payment I found was from January." "That's impossible," Silas said. "We've been paying Luther every 2 weeks since—" He stopped. Since James had handled the accounts. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground was about to give way, but unable to step back. "Show me the records," he said finally. "Everything related to the farrier." They moved to the office, leaving one of the other hands to watch over Ranger. Evelyn went straight to one of her organized stacks, pulling out a ledger marked with a ribbon. Here, your payment logs for services rendered. She opened to a marked page. Last documented payment to Luther James, farrier, was January 14th. After that, nothing. But Marcus has been telling me... Silas looked at his foreman. You said Luther was coming regular. Marcus's face had gone pale. Boss, I swear, I thought... The schedule book showed... May I see this schedule book? Evelyn's voice had gone very quiet. Marcus retrieved it from a desk drawer, hands shaking slightly as he passed it over. Evelyn examined it with the same focused intensity she brought to everything else, her eyes moving rapidly across entries. The handwriting changes, she said after a moment. The earlier entries match other samples I've seen in ranch correspondence. Later ones are different. Someone's been making false entries. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. Who has access to that book? Anyone in the office, me, you, the hands who report in each evening. Marcus's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. Boss, I didn't know. I trusted... Who actually handled the scheduling and payments after James died? The question hung there for 3 long heartbeats before Marcus answered. I delegated most of it to save you the burden. Thought I was helping. Delegated to who? Jenkins. He's been with us 4 years, handles supply coordination. Seemed natural to... Silas was already moving, rage building in his throat like a physical thing. He stormed out of the house, across the yard to where the hands were gathering for morning assignments. He found Jenkins near the corral, a lean man in his 40s with a reputation for being reliable and detail-oriented. Jenkins, office, now. Something flickered across the man's face. Guilt, calculation, fear. He started backing away. Boss, I can explain. I said now, or you can explain to the sheriff. That stopped him. Jenkins's shoulders slumped, and he followed Silas back to the house like a man walking to the gallows. Marcus was waiting on the porch, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. Inside, Evelyn had pulled out more ledgers, more papers, building what looked like a case that could bury a man. 3 months, she said without preamble when Jenkins entered. That's how long you've been skimming. Probably longer, but that's how far back I've traced it definitively. False supply orders, inflated purchase prices with kickbacks, delayed service payments you pocketed instead of forwarding. The farrier was just one piece. How much total did you steal? Jenkins looked at Silas, then at the floor. I wasn't trying to hurt the ranch, just needed a little extra. Times being hard. How much? Silas's voice came out deadly calm. Maybe $800, give or take. Evelyn shook her head. Try $1,240. I have documentation. The number hit Silas like a physical blow. $1,200. More than some families saw in 3 years. Stolen bit by bit while James was dying, while Silas was buried in grief and trying to hold everything together. Pack your things, he said quietly. You've got 1 hour to get off my property. Boss, please, I've got nowhere. 1 hour. After that, I'm riding to town for the sheriff, and you can explain your bookkeeping to a judge. Silas stepped closer, letting every ounce of rage show in his eyes. And if I ever see you within 50 miles of this ranch again, documentation won't matter because there won't be enough left of you to prosecute. Jenkins ran. Actually ran from the office, footsteps pounding across the porch and toward the bunkhouse. Marcus stood frozen, looking gut-shot. Boss, I should have caught this. I was supposed to be watching. Not now, Marcus. Silas couldn't deal with recrimination and guilt, not when his own failure felt like a weight crushing his chest. He'd been so focused on the land, the animals, the day-to-day survival, that he'd missed a threat operating right under his nose. Evelyn was gathering papers, organizing the evidence into neat stacks. All business, like she uncovered theft every day before breakfast. I'll need to continue the audit, she said. If Jenkins was stealing, there's a possibility others were involved or that additional discrepancies exist I haven't found yet. Do whatever you need to do. She glanced up at him, and for the first time her expression showed something other than professional competence. Concern, maybe. Or understanding. For what it's worth, Mr. Crowley, this wasn't your fault. Embezzlement schemes like this are designed to be invisible, especially to someone grieving and overwhelmed. Your brother suspected something was wrong, but even he didn't have proof. That's why he hired me. Yeah, well, he's not here to see how right he was. The words came out bitter, and Silas immediately regretted them. This woman had just saved his ranch from bleeding out financially, had spotted a problem in his best horse that could have resulted in permanent injury, and he was being an ass about it. "I apologize," he said stiffly. "That was uncalled for. Grief makes us say things we don't mean. I understand." She returned her attention to the ledgers. "I'll have a complete report ready within 2 weeks, possibly sooner now that I know what I'm looking for. In the meantime, I recommend changing your payment authorization procedures. No single person should handle both ordering and payment verification. I'll talk to Marcus about it." "Good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have approximately 800 entries to cross-reference before lunch." Silas left her to it, walking out into morning sunlight that felt wrong somehow. Too bright, too normal for a day that had already gone to hell. He found Tommy in the stable, looking terrified. "I swear I didn't know about the trimming, boss. Jenkins said the farrier came while I was doing fence work, said everything was fine." "I know, kid. Not your fault." Silas moved to Ranger's stall, running a hand down the horse's neck. "But we're getting Luther out here today to fix this, and from now on, you watch every service visit personally. Nobody works on these animals without someone reliable witnessing." "Yes, sir." "And Tommy, if you ever see something that doesn't look right, you come to me directly. Not Marcus, not anyone else. Me." The boy nodded, looking relieved that he wasn't being fired or worse. Silas stayed with Ranger for a while, checking the injury Evelyn had spotted, marveling that he'd missed something so obvious once you knew to look for it. She'd been on the property less than 24 hours and had already broken every rule he'd set, uncovered a major theft, and potentially saved his best horse. The rules that had protected him for years suddenly seemed less like wisdom and more like walls keeping him blind. The rest of the day passed in a blur of damage control. Luther arrived within 3 hours, confirming Evelyn's diagnosis and providing treatment that would take weeks to fully resolve. The farrier also mentioned that he'd wondered why the scheduled appointments kept getting canceled, but figured the ranch was too busy to need his services. "Jenkins told you we canceled?" Silas asked. "Every time for the last 4 months. Said you'd call when ready. I assumed you had another farrier working the ranch." Another lie. Another piece of the scheme that could have ended in disaster. Silas paid Luther double the usual rate and asked him to spread the word that Crowley Ranch was no longer working with Jenkins on any capacity. By evening, the entire ranch knew what had happened. The hands were quiet, subdued, probably worried about their own positions. Silas called a meeting in the main barn, every man assembled and waiting. "Jenkins is gone," he said without preamble. "He was stealing from the ranch, and he's lucky I didn't do worse than fire him. Now I need to know. Anyone else involved in anything similar, you've got until sunrise tomorrow to confess. After that, if I find out you've been lying, you won't get the chance to walk away." Silence. Shifting feet. Nervous glances. "Boss," one of the older hands spoke up. "Most of us didn't know. We just did our jobs, collected our pay. Jenkins kept to himself mostly." "I believe you, but trust is earned, and right now we're starting from scratch. You do honest work, you get honest pay. You steal, you're gone. Clear?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Silas dismissed them, watching as they dispersed to their evening routines. Marcus lingered, looking like he wanted to say something. "Whatever it is, make it quick," Silas said. "I failed you, boss. Should have been paying closer attention. We both should have. James hired an auditor for a reason. He knew something was wrong, and we were too busy to see it." Silas sighed, feeling every year of his age settling into his bones. "But we're seeing it now, and that's what matters. That woman, Miss Hart, she's something else." "Yeah. You gonna let her finish the audit?" Silas looked toward the house, where lamplight glowed in the office window. Evelyn would be in there, working through numbers that told stories most people never learned to read. "Yeah," he said again. "We're gonna let her finish." He found her still at the desk when he went inside for supper, surrounded by papers that now made a kind of sense if you knew what you were looking at. She'd created categories, timelines, documentation trails that transformed chaos into clarity. "You need to eat something," Silas said from the doorway. "Soon. I'm in the middle of reconciling the livestock sales against reported income, and I think I've found another inconsistency." "Miss Hart." She looked up, blinking like someone emerging from deep water. "Yes?" "It's past 8. The numbers will still be there in the morning. I'm close to tomorrow," he said firmly. "You've already pulled off one miracle today. Don't push your luck." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Quick, unexpected, gone almost before it registered. I suppose even financial records deserve rest. She stood, stretching in a way that suggested she'd been sitting far too long. Silas noticed for the first time that she'd removed her jacket, worked in just her shirtwaist and skirt. Professional armor partially shed in favor of comfort. Somehow that felt more significant than it should. In the kitchen, he found cold chicken and bread that wasn't completely stale. They ate in silence, not uncomfortable, just the quiet of two people too tired for conversation. Evelyn ate like someone who'd forgotten food existed until it was in front of her, focused and efficient. "Thank you," she said finally, setting down her fork. "For Ranger, I mean. For getting the farrier immediately. Some men would have waited to verify my diagnosis, cost the animal days of unnecessary pain. You were right about the horse. Figured you might be right about other things, too." How generous of you to consider that possibility. There was no heat in the words, just dry observation. Silas found himself almost smiling despite everything. "Those rules I mentioned yesterday, the ones I broke within hours of arriving? Yeah, those. They existed for reasons that seemed important at the time. And now?" He considered the question, watching lamplight play across her tired features. "Now I'm thinking maybe the reasons weren't as good as I believed." "Rules are useful when they protect something valuable," Evelyn said. "Less so when they simply protect us from being uncomfortable." "That what you think I was doing? Staying comfortable?" "I think you were staying safe. There's a difference." She stood, gathering dishes. But safety and stagnation often look remarkably similar from the outside. The observation stung because it was accurate. Silas had spent years building walls, physical and otherwise, around everything he cared about, keeping people at distance, maintaining control through rigid structure. It had worked, in the sense that nothing bad had happened. It had also meant nothing particularly good happened either. "You should get some rest," he said, instead of pursuing that thought further. "Tomorrow's going to be another long day." "They're all long days, Mr. Crowley. That's the nature of the work." She left him sitting in the kitchen, listening to her footsteps on the stairs. Outside, the ranch settled into night sounds, horses shifting in their stalls, wind moving through the grass, distant coyote calls. The same sounds that had lulled him to sleep for 15 years. But something had changed. A woman in a dusty blue dress had walked onto his property, broken his rules, and showed him just how much he'd been missing while locked inside his own carefully constructed prison. Silas sat there until the lamp burned low, thinking about theft and horses, and the way Evelyn Hart had looked at his accounts like they were puzzles demanding to be solved, thinking about James, who'd known something was wrong, and had reached out for help even while dying. His brother had trusted a stranger to see what family had missed. Maybe it was time Silas started trusting that instinct. He found her in the office again at dawn, already working. This time he didn't comment, just brought her coffee and left her to it. The day unfolded around her presence, ranch work continuing while she dismantled months of deception, one ledger entry at a time. By sunset, she'd uncovered 2 more instances of inflated purchases, both tied to Jenkins's network of suppliers who kicked back percentages. By the end of the week, the total had climbed to nearly $1,500 stolen across 8 months. And every evening, Silas found himself in that office, watching her work, sometimes talking through what she'd found, sometimes just sitting in silence while she explained accounting principles that actually started making sense when she described them. The hands learned to accept her presence, stopped staring when she walked across the yard, started tipping their hats and calling her ma'am like she belonged there. Slowly, without anyone quite noticing when it happened, the rules stopped mattering. Evelyn Hart had arrived as an auditor hired to find missing money. But as the Texas sun set on another day of honest work and difficult truths, Silas was starting to suspect she might be uncovering something far more valuable than stolen cash. She was showing him what happened when you stopped hiding behind rules and started seeing what was actually there. And what he saw, when he finally allowed himself to look, was a woman who'd walked into chaos and transformed it into clarity, who'd saved his horse, protected his ranch, and somehow made him feel less alone than he had in years. The audit would be finished soon. The theft documented, the losses calculated, the recommendations made. Evelyn Hart would pack her trunk, board the next stagecoach, and disappear back into whatever life she'd left behind, unless he found a reason for her to stay. The thought terrified him more than any threat he'd faced on the frontier. But as Silas watched her work, bent over numbers that danced in lamplight, he realized that some risks were worth taking, even for a man who'd built his entire life on staying safe. The second week brought heat that turned the ranch into something out of a fever dream. The kind of brutal Texas summer that made men question their life choices and horses stand motionless in whatever shade they could find. Evelyn worked through it like the temperature was a minor inconvenience, though Silas noticed she'd started rolling up her sleeves and keeping her hair in a loose braid instead of the severe bun she'd arrived with. She was also asking more questions. "Your cattle count from the spring drive doesn't match the inventory James recorded in March," she said one afternoon, catching Silas as he came in from checking the south water tank. "You documented selling 240 head in Kansas City, but the starting count was only 231. Where did the extra 9 come from?" Silas poured himself water from the pitcher, buying time to think. "Could be James miscounted. We were dealing with a lot that month. Your brother's counts are consistently accurate throughout the ledgers. He rechecked his work, made notations when he corrected errors. This isn't a mistake. It's missing information." "Then I don't know what to tell you." She studied him with those sharp eyes that saw too much. "Or you do know, and you're protecting someone." "I'm not protecting anyone. I'm saying sometimes the count gets fuzzy when you're moving livestock across territories. Things happen." "What things?" He set down the cup harder than necessary. "Miss Hart, I've been patient with your questions, but there's a difference between auditing accounts and interrogating every decision made on this ranch." "Is there?" She didn't back down, didn't soften her tone. "Because from where I'm standing, those 9 extra cattle represent either income that wasn't properly recorded, which is tax fraud, or livestock that was acquired through means you'd rather not document, which is potentially theft." "Now you're calling me a thief?" "I'm calling the numbers inconsistent. What you choose to hear in that observation says more about your conscience than my accusations." They stared at each other across the office, tension crackling like summer lightning. Silas felt his temper rising, the same anger that had gotten him into trouble more than once before he'd learned to control it. This woman had been here less than 2 weeks and was already implying he was as bad as Jenkins. "Those cattle came from the Henderson place," he said finally, voice tight. "Old man Henderson died last winter, left his daughter trying to run a homestead she couldn't manage. She had livestock she couldn't feed and debts she couldn't pay. I bought 9 head for less than market value because she needed cash immediately, and I was the only one willing to pay fair instead of robbing her blind." "And you didn't record the purchase why?" "Because I paid her directly, in cash, so the bank couldn't claim it against her father's debts. She needed that money to survive until she could sell the property. I wasn't about to create paperwork that would have gotten seized by creditors." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. Less accusatory, more thoughtful. "That was kind of you." "It was practical. She got money, I got cattle at a decent price, business. Business that you deliberately kept off the books to protect her interests. That's not quite the same thing. You going to report it to the tax assessor?" She considered this for a long moment, tapping her pen against the ledger in a rhythm that probably meant something in her mathematical mind. "The purchase price you paid? Was it fair?" Fair enough that she thanked me with tears in her eyes, and I felt like a vulture anyway. "Then no, I'm not reporting anything. But it needs to be documented correctly going forward. I can structure the bookkeeping in ways that protect privacy while maintaining legal accuracy. That's actually part of what I do." Silas blinked. "You can do that?" "Mr. Crowley, wealthy families don't hire auditors just to count their money. They hire us to find legal ways to preserve it. The Henderson transaction was charitable under duress. There are ways to record it that protect all parties involved." "Huh." He pulled out a chair, suddenly tired of standing. "Didn't know that was possible. Most people don't. They assume all accounting is either completely honest or completely fraudulent, with no middle ground for complexity." She made a note in her journal. Financial reality is rarely that simple. They sat in silence for a while, the heat pressing against the windows like something physical. Silas watched her work, marveling at how quickly his anger had dissolved once she understood the full situation. Most people would have judged first and listened never. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to regardless of my answer. Why do you do this? Travel around alone, dig through other people's messes, deal with men who don't want you there?" Evelyn didn't look up from her calculations. Because I'm good at it. That's not a real answer. It's the only answer that matters. She paused, reconsidering. My father died when I was 16. Left my mother with debts she didn't know existed and accounts she couldn't decipher. The men who came to settle the estate lied to her face, told her there was nothing left when in fact there was enough to keep us comfortable for years. She believed them because she'd never been taught to question financial authority. What happened? I taught myself accounting, spent 2 years learning everything I could, then challenged the settlement. Got back most of what was stolen, though by then my mother had already worked herself sick trying to survive. Evelyn's voice remained steady, but her pen had stopped moving. She died thinking we were poor. I proved we weren't 3 months too late. The story hit Silas harder than he expected. He'd assumed Evelyn did this work for money or independence or some abstract principle. Never considered she might be fighting a war that had already been lost. I'm sorry. Don't be. It taught me that numbers don't lie. But people who control numbers often do. Someone needs to know the difference. She resumed her calculations. Besides, the work pays well, and I'm not suited for traditional marriage. This seemed like the better option. Not suited how? She glanced up with a look that suggested he was being deliberately dense. I'm 37 years old, Mr. Crowley. I have opinions on subjects women aren't supposed to understand, no patience for social pretense, and a tendency to correct men when they're wrong. Exactly what husband do you imagine would tolerate that? One with half a brain in the sense to value competence over compliance? The words came out before he'd thought them through, and Evelyn's expression shifted into something he couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe. Or reassessment. That's a pleasant theory, she said carefully. Reality tends to disagree. Before Silas could figure out how to respond to that, Marcus appeared in the doorway looking agitated. Boss, we've got a problem with the fence line. Something big went through it, broke 3 posts clean off. Silas stood immediately. Show me. They rode out together, leaving Evelyn to her ledgers. The damage was worse than Marcus had described. Not just broken posts, but torn wire and trampled ground suggesting something had charged through with serious force. Silas examined the tracks, frowning at what he found. Cattle, he said, but not ours. These prints are bigger, different spacing. Henderson's old stock, maybe? Heard the new owner was letting them run pretty wild. Henderson Place was bought? This was news. When? Last week, apparently. Some outfit from Dallas. Haven't seen anyone working it yet, but the cattle are definitely back there. Silas straightened, already calculating problems. The Henderson homestead bordered his southern property line. If the new owners were running cattle without proper fencing, this could become a regular issue. Get the posts replaced today. Double wire if we've got it. He swung back into the saddle. I'll ride over tomorrow, introduce myself to whoever bought the place. Better to handle this neighborly before it becomes a war. By the time he got back to the house, evening was settling in, and Evelyn had moved her work to the kitchen table. She'd laid out what looked like a complete financial map of the ranch. Income streams, expense categories, seasonal patterns, all rendered in her precise handwriting. You're going to wear yourself out, Silas said, lighting a lamp. I'm close to finished. Another few days, and I'll have the complete audit ready for your review. And then what? She looked up from her papers, and in the lamplight, her face showed the exhaustion she'd been hiding. Then I return to Boston, and you go back to running your ranch. Just like that? That's generally how contracts work, yes. Silas wanted to argue with that, wanted to say something about how she'd become part of the daily rhythm here, how the hands asked after her opinion now. And Marcus had started bringing financial questions directly to her. How the office felt empty on the rare occasions when she wasn't buried in ledgers. Instead, he said, found out someone bought the Henderson place. Going to ride over tomorrow, see what kind of neighbors we're getting. Want company? The offer came casually, but her eyes were sharp with interest. I'd like to see the property that generated your mysterious 9 cattle. It's a long ride in this heat. I've endured worse. They left after dawn before the sun turned vicious. Evelyn rode like someone who'd grown up on horses, comfortable in the saddle despite wearing a riding skirt that had clearly seen better days. She'd borrowed a hat from somewhere, wide-brimmed and practical. The Henderson homestead looked worse than Silas remembered. The house needed paint, the barn was leaning slightly, and the corrals were held together with hope and determination. But there were signs of new activity, fresh lumber stacked near the barn, tools that hadn't been there before, a wagon loaded with supplies. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, wiping his hands on a rag. Mid-50s, weathered face, the build of someone who'd done hard labor his entire life. Behind him came a younger man, probably his son, based on the similar features. "Help you folks?" The older man's tone was polite but cautious. Silas dismounted. "Silas Crowley. I own the ranch that borders your south fence. Wanted to introduce myself, welcome you to the area. Carl Mitchell, this is my son, David." They shook hands. "Didn't realize we had neighbors so close. Your cattle broke through our shared fence line yesterday. No real damage, but figured we should talk about maintaining that boundary before it becomes an issue." Mitchell's expression tightened. "Damn it, I told the broker those animals were included in the sale, didn't realize they were running loose. I'll get them rounded up today." "Appreciate that." Silas gestured to Evelyn, who'd remained mounted. "This is Miss Hart. She's helping me sort out some business matters." Mitchell nodded politely, but his attention was already drifting back to the barn. "Look, Mr. Crowley, I appreciate you riding over. Once we get properly set up here, I'll make sure the fencing is solid. Right now, we're just trying to make the place livable." "You planning to run cattle?" "Eventually. Bought this property thinking we'd start small, build up over time. Seemed like a good opportunity." He hesitated. "Though I'm starting to wonder if we got sold a dream instead of a working homestead." David spoke up for the first time. "Water rights are tangled up with 3 other properties. The well needs complete rebuilding. Half the fencing is rotten through. And the survey markers are off by almost 40 yards from where the broker's map showed them." Evelyn had gone very still in her saddle. "Did you hire a surveyor to verify the property lines before purchase?" Broker said it wasn't necessary. Had official documents showing the boundaries. Official documents can be deliberately inaccurate if no one bothers to verify them against physical markers. She dismounted smoothly. "May I see the deed and survey papers?" Mitchell looked uncertain. "I don't mean offense, ma'am, but this is our business. I'm a financial auditor, Mr. Mitchell. If you were sold property under false pretenses, those documents will show it. I can review them in 10 minutes and tell you whether you have legal recourse or just expensive problems." The 2 men exchanged glances. Finally, Carl nodded. "They're in the house. Come on." Silas followed them inside, curious despite himself. The Henderson place looked different inside, furniture removed, walls bare, everything stripped down to structure. Mitchell retrieved a folder from a travel trunk, spreading papers across a dusty table. Evelyn examined them with the same focused intensity she brought to the ranch ledgers. Her finger traced lines on the survey map, compared descriptions in the deed, cross-referenced against what looked like tax documents. "This is fraudulent," she said after 5 minutes. "What?" "The survey description lists the south boundary as running along a creek bed that dried up 12 years ago. The markers reference a cottonwood grove that was cleared for lumber in 1879. Either this survey was drawn from outdated records, or someone deliberately used old landmarks to obscure the actual property lines." She looked up at Mitchell. "What did you pay?" $1,500. "For how many acres?" Broker said 160 plus water rights to the spring. Evelyn pulled out another document, scanning quickly. The registered deed lists 137 acres, and the water rights are shared with 2 adjacent properties who have senior claims. You paid premium price for land you don't fully own, with resources you can't exclusively access. Carl Mitchell's face had gone the color of old paper. But the broker showed us everything, explained the whole situation. The broker worked for the company selling the property. Their job was to maximize sale price, not protect your interests. Did you have independent legal representation? Couldn't afford a lawyer on top of the purchase price. So you trusted the seller's agent to handle a transaction where they benefited from your ignorance. Evelyn's voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel, but the judgment was clear. That was foolish. David slammed his fist on the table. "We came here to start over, invested everything we had. Now you're saying we got robbed? I'm saying you purchased property without proper verification and got exactly what you should have expected, less than you were promised." She gathered the papers into a neat stack. "But you're not without options. The fraudulent survey gives you grounds to challenge the sale. If you can prove the selling company knowingly misrepresented the property details, you might recover damages or force a price adjustment. How do we prove that?" Hire a competent surveyor to establish the true boundaries. Get written statements from anyone with knowledge of the old markers. Document every discrepancy between what was promised and what actually exists. Evelyn met Mitchell's desperate eyes. Then find a lawyer who works on contingency and prepare for a legal battle that could take years. The silence that followed felt like standing in a grave. These men had gambled their future on this property and lost before they'd even started. Silas knew that feeling intimately, the sick realization that you'd been played for a fool and couldn't afford to admit it. "What's the alternative?" Carl asked quietly. "Make the best of what you have. The land itself is still viable, just less than promised. The water situation is complicated but manageable if you negotiate sharing agreements with the senior rights holders. It won't be the opportunity you thought you were buying, but it's not worthless either." Easy for you to say. Actually, it's not easy at all. I'm telling you that someone took advantage of your hope and left you with hard choices. There's nothing easy about that truth. Silas watched Evelyn deliver this assessment with clinical precision. No softening of the blow, no false comfort. Just honesty served cold and direct. The Mitchells looked gutted, but they also looked like men who now understood exactly what they were facing. "I might be able to help with the water situation," Silas heard himself say. "My South Spring runs stronger than we need. We could work out a sharing arrangement that gives you reliable access without fighting legal battles over the Henderson rights." Carl looked up sharply. "Why would you do that?" But. "Because watching the Dallas Land Company rob homesteaders makes me angry, and spite is a powerful motivator." It was true enough, though not the whole truth. The whole truth was standing next to him in a dusty riding skirt, radiating fierce satisfaction at having exposed another fraud. They worked out basic terms before leaving, water sharing in exchange for Mitchell maintaining the shared fence line. Not charity, not quite business, something in between that felt right, even if Silas couldn't articulate why. On the ride back, Evelyn was quiet, thinking, processing, doing whatever complex calculations happened in that sharp mind. "You didn't have to offer the water," she said finally. "Seemed like the right thing to do. The right thing and the profitable thing are rarely the same." "Maybe. But watching them get crushed by that land company reminded me of something my brother used to say. You can't control whether other people are honest, but you can damn well control whether you are." Evelyn glanced at him, and something in her expression made Silas's chest feel tight. "James sounds like he was a good man." "He was. Better than me in most ways." "I doubt that." They rode in silence for a while, the ranch buildings visible in the distance. Silas found himself not wanting this ride to end, not wanting to go back to the separate rhythms where she worked in the office, and he worked the land, and they only intersected at meals. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn's voice cut through his thoughts. "Seems to be the theme lately. When your brother hired me, when you first saw that letter, why did you really agree to let me stay? It couldn't have been just because of the contract terms." Silas considered lying, considered deflecting, chose honesty instead. "Because James was careful about people. If he trusted you enough to hire you while dying, that meant something. And because—" He stopped, searching for words. "Because the rules I'd built around this place were starting to feel less like protection and more like a prison. Didn't realize that until you broke them all in one morning. And now? Now I'm thinking maybe I built those rules to avoid being hurt again. But what I actually avoided was living." The words hung in the hot afternoon air between them. Evelyn looked straight ahead, her face unreadable, but her hands had tightened slightly on the reins. "That's a dangerous realization," she said. "Yeah. Changes like that, they're not simple. You can't just decide to be different and wake up transformed." "I know. Do you?" She turned to face him fully now, and her eyes were serious. "Because I've watched men have these revelations before, Silas. They decide they want to change. They mean it genuinely, and then the actual work of changing proves harder than they imagined. Old patterns reassert themselves. Comfort wins over growth. Good intentions become regrets." The use of his first name registered somewhere in the back of his mind, but he was too focused on what she was actually saying to comment on it. "You think I'll fail?" "I think change is difficult, and most people give up halfway through. Not because they're weak, but because it's genuinely hard to become someone new." "And if I don't give up, then you might actually build something worth having instead of just something that feels safe." She urged her horse forward. "But that's a hell of a gamble." They didn't speak again until they reached the ranch. Marcus met them in the yard with news that 2 more cattle had broken through from the Mitchell property and the hands had spent the afternoon rounding them up. Silas dealt with it, getting the animals secured and the fence temporarily patched while making mental notes to ride back over tomorrow with proper materials. By the time he returned to the house, Evelyn was back in the office, working by lamplight despite the late hour. He stood in the doorway watching her, this woman who'd appeared in his life like a dust storm and left nothing unchanged. "You should rest," he said. "So should you." "Yeah, well, the ranch doesn't run itself." "Neither does a complete financial audit." But she set down her pen, rubbing her eyes. "Though I suppose another hour won't make much difference at this point. How much longer do you need, for the audit, I mean?" 3 days, maybe 4. "I'm in final review now, checking my calculations, verifying I haven't missed anything significant." 3 days? Less than a week before she'd pack her trunk and disappear back to whatever life waited in Boston. The thought sat in Silas's stomach like bad food. "And then what?" he asked. "You've got another job lined up?" "I always have work lined up. Estate settlements, business audits, fraud investigations. People who need numbers explained and money recovered." She stood, stretching. "Why do you ask?" "Because I don't want you to leave. Because this ranch feels different with you here. Because I'm terrified that once you're gone, I'll go back to being the man who hid behind rules and called it strength." "Just curious," he said instead. "Wondered if you ever stayed in one place longer than a few weeks." "Occasionally, if the work demands it or the situation is particularly complex." She moved to the window, looking out at darkness punctuated by distant ranch lights. "But usually I prefer to keep moving. Easier that way." "Easier how?" "Easier to stay objective. Easier to leave when the job is done. Easier to avoid complications." "What kind of complications?" Evelyn turned to face him, and in the lamplight her expression was unguarded for once. "Tired, yes, but something else too. Something that looked almost like loneliness." "The kind where people start to matter more than the work," she said quietly. "The kind where leaving stops being simple." The air between them felt charged with things unsaid, with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. Silas knew he should walk away, let this moment pass, maintain the careful distance they'd both been pretending still existed. Instead he said, "Would that be so terrible?" "Yes." No hesitation, no softening. "Because I've spent 15 years building a life that works precisely because I don't let people matter that much. I'm good at what I do because I stay detached, analytical, focused on the numbers instead of the faces attached to them. Start caring about the people and you lose that edge. Make compromises you shouldn't. Miss things you can't afford to miss. Or maybe you see things that actually matter instead of just what the ledgers show. That's a romantic notion with no basis in practical reality." "Is it?" Silas moved closer, not crowding but closing the distance. "You cared about the Mitchells today. Cared enough to show them the truth even when it hurt. That wasn't detachment. That was someone who gives a damn about justice even when it's inconvenient." "Justice and sentiment aren't the same thing." "Maybe not, but they're closer than you pretend." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. "Why are we having this conversation, Silas?" "Because in 3 days you're leaving and I'm trying to figure out if that's what you actually want or just what feels safer. It's what makes sense. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you." She brushed past him, heading for the stairs and whatever solitude her room provided. Silas let her go, knowing pushing harder would only drive her further into the walls she'd built around herself. He understood those walls, had lived behind similar ones for years. The difference was, he was starting to want out of his. And the woman who'd shown him what life looked like beyond those walls was about to walk away because she was still locked inside her own. The next few days passed too quickly. Evelyn worked relentlessly, completing her audit with the same precision she brought to everything. Silas found excuses to be in the office more than necessary, bringing her coffee, asking questions about the findings, anything to extend their conversations beyond pure business. She was, he discovered, funny when she let her guard down. Dry wit that caught him off balance and made him laugh despite himself. She had opinions on everything from horse breeding to territorial politics, delivered with confidence that dared you to disagree. And she listened when he talked about the ranch, the land, the dreams he and James had built this place around. It felt like the beginning of something neither was ready to name, On the third evening, Evelyn called him to the office. She'd compiled her findings into a neat stack of documents, each section organized and explained with clarity that made sense even to someone who'd rather work with horses than numbers. The total loss from Jenkins's theft was $1,623 over 9 months, she said, walking him through the summary. I've documented every fraudulent transaction with supporting evidence. If you pursue criminal charges, this should be sufficient for prosecution. And if I don't, then at least you know the scope of the damage and can prevent it happening again. She handed him a second document. These are my recommendations for financial controls, basic procedures that will make theft significantly harder without adding unreasonable overhead to daily operations. Silas scanned the list, impressed by how practical it all seemed. You really think this'll work? I know it will. I've implemented similar systems for operations 3 times your size. The key is consistency, actually following the procedures instead of treating them as suggestions. Marcus is going to hate the extra paperwork. Marcus will appreciate not being blamed if something goes wrong again. She pulled out a final document. This is my fee statement. The balance owed after your brother's advance, plus expenses for materials and extended stay. You can remit payment to my Boston address at your convenience. The number was fair, probably less than she could have charged given how much money she'd recovered. Silas set it aside, not ready to deal with the finality it represented. When do you leave? Stagecoach runs through tomorrow afternoon. I'll be on it. Tomorrow. Less than 24 hours before she disappeared from his life as suddenly as she'd entered it. You could stay longer, he said, knowing it was pointless but unable to stop himself. Help implement these controls. Make sure we're doing it right. You don't need me for that. The instructions are clear enough for anyone with basic literacy to follow. Her tone remained professional, but something flickered across her face too fast to catch. Besides, I have other commitments waiting. Right, of course. They stood there in the office that had become their shared space over the past weeks, surrounded by ledgers and lamplight, and all the careful distance they'd built between themselves. Silas wanted to say something that would make her reconsider, wanted to offer something compelling enough to outweigh all her logical reasons for leaving. But he'd never been good with words, and the ones that mattered stuck in his throat like stones. Thank you, he said finally, for everything. James knew what he was doing when he hired you. I hope the audit helps. The ranch is sound, Silas, better than most operations I've reviewed. Don't let one bad employee make you doubt what you've built here. I won't, she nodded, gathering her papers. I should pack. Early start tomorrow. Yeah, good night, Evelyn. Good night. He watched her leave, and it felt like watching something vital walk out of his life. Like he'd finally found someone who understood both the numbers and the land, who could be sharp enough to catch theft and kind enough to care about justice, who looked at him like he was more than just the ranch he owned. And he was letting her go because neither of them was brave enough to say what this actually was. Silas didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at ceiling beams he'd helped install years ago, listening to the house settle around him and thinking about all the things he should have said and didn't. Somewhere upstairs, Evelyn was probably packing her trunk with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything else, preparing to walk out of his life like the past 3 weeks had been just another job. Maybe for her, that's all it was. He was up before dawn, moving through morning routines on autopilot. The horses needed feeding, the hands needed direction, the ranch required his attention regardless of what was happening in his head. Marcus found him in the stable, pitching hay with more force than necessary. You gonna tell her? Marcus asked without preamble. Tell who what? Don't play stupid, boss. It doesn't suit you. Marcus leaned against the stall door, arms crossed. That woman's leaving in a few hours, and you've been walking around like someone kicked your dog. Either say something or don't, but stop pretending this is just about the audit. Silas drove the pitchfork into the hay bale harder than needed. There's nothing to say. She's got a life in Boston. I've got the ranch. That's the reality. Reality is what you make it. When did you become a philosopher? About the same time you became a coward. Marcus's voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel. I've known you 15 years, Silas. Watched you build this place from nothing, fight off claim jumpers, survive drought and disease and every other damn thing Texas could throw at you. Never once saw you back down from something that mattered, but one woman scares you worse than all of that combined. It's not that simple. It never is. Doesn't mean you give up without trying. Silas wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the logical reasons why pursuing this made no sense. But the words stuck in his throat because Marcus was right. He'd faced down armed men over water rights, had rebuilt after losing everything to fire, had kept going after James died, even when grief made breathing feel impossible. But the thought of telling Evelyn he wanted her to stay terrified him in ways actual danger never had. What if she says no? The question came out quieter than intended. Then at least you'll know. Better than spending the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you'd had the guts to ask. Marcus left him with that, heading off to coordinate the day's work. Silas finished with the horses, his mind churning through possibilities and outcomes and 100 different ways this could go wrong. By the time he headed back to the house, the sun was climbing and his resolve was wavering between determination and panic. He found Evelyn in the kitchen, her trunk already by the door. She'd changed into traveling clothes, the same blue dress she'd arrived in, cleaned and mended but still showing the wear of hard miles. Her hair was back in that severe bun, every strand controlled and proper. The transformation from the woman who'd rolled up her sleeves in the office back to the professional auditor felt deliberate, like armor being reassembled. "Morning," she said, pouring coffee with steady hands. "Stagecoach should be here around noon. I thought I'd review the implementation notes with you one more time before I leave." "Evelyn, the key is maintaining consistent documentation. Every purchase order needs to be verified against actual receipt of goods, and payment authorization should never come from the same person who initiated the order. It seems tedious, but that's precisely what makes it effective." Evelyn, stop. She paused, coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Stop what?" "Talking about procedures and documentation like that's what matters right now." Silas moved closer, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "We need to talk about what's actually happening here." "I'm leaving. That's what's happening. Is that what you want?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she might actually answer honestly. Instead, she set down the coffee with careful precision. "What I want is irrelevant. I have obligations in Boston, contracts I've committed to. This job is finished." "The job, sure, but that's not what I'm asking about." "Then what are you asking?" Silas had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his head overnight, planned out careful words that would make his case without pushing too hard. All of that disappeared in the face of her deliberate composure, leaving him with nothing but raw honesty. "I'm asking if you feel what I feel when we're in the same room. If you notice that conversations started taking longer because neither of us wanted to leave. If you realize somewhere in the last 3 weeks that this stopped being about the audit and became something else entirely." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her knuckles went white around the coffee cup. "Silas, don't do this." "Don't do what? Tell you the truth? Ask you to consider staying? Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Her voice stayed level, controlled, but there was strain underneath. "I've been doing this work for 15 years. I know better than to confuse temporary proximity with genuine connection. We worked together, we got along, and now the job is done. That's all this is." "That's a lie and you know it. It's practical reality. It's you hiding behind professionalism because actually admitting you care about something scares you worse than any risk you've ever audited." The words came out harsher than intended, but Silas was too frustrated to soften them. "You talk about how numbers don't lie, but you've been lying to yourself this whole time about what's happening between us." She set the coffee down completely, hands bracing against the counter. "And what exactly do you think is happening? You believe 3 weeks of proximity created some profound connection that justifies me upending my entire life? That's not romance, Silas. That's desperation dressed up as fate." The accusation hit hard because part of him wondered if she was right. Maybe he was just lonely, grasping at the first real connection he'd felt since James died. Maybe this was temporary insanity brought on by isolation and grief. But when he looked at her, really looked past the armor she'd reconstructed, he saw the same fear he felt, the same desperate hope warring with practiced cynicism. She wasn't rejecting what they had. She was terrified of it. "You're right," he said quietly. 3 weeks isn't enough time to know for certain, but it's enough to know this matters, that it could become something real if we gave it a chance. And I think you know that too, or you wouldn't be working so hard to convince yourself otherwise." "What do you want from me?" The question came out almost angry. "You want me to stay here, play house on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, pretend I'm someone I'm not?" I want you to stop running from the first genuine thing that's happened to either of us in years. I want you to consider that maybe your life in Boston isn't as fulfilling as you pretend it is, or you wouldn't have worked 16-hour days to avoid thinking about leaving. And I want you to be honest with me and yourself about whether you actually want to go or if you're just too scared to stay. The silence that followed felt endless. Evelyn stared at him with an expression caught between fury and something that looked dangerously close to hope. Her careful composure was cracking, showing the real person underneath all that professional distance. "I can't," she said finally, voice rough. "I can't be what you need. I don't know how to be someone's partner, how to share a life, how to put down roots in one place. I've spent my entire adult life being self-sufficient, answerable to no one, free to leave whenever circumstances demanded it. You're asking me to give up everything I've built for something that might not even work. I'm asking you to take a chance on something that might be better than what you're running back to. And if it fails, if we try this and it falls apart, then what? I've destroyed my reputation, abandoned my clients, disrupted my entire life for nothing? Then you go back to Boston and rebuild. Same as you did after your mother died, same as you've done every time life knocked you down." Silas took a step closer. "But at least you'd know. At least you wouldn't spend the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you'd been brave enough to try." Her eyes glistened, not quite tears, but close. "That's not fair. None of this is fair. Fair would be meeting you 10 years ago, having time to do this properly, not facing an impossible decision with a stagecoach arriving in 3 hours." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he took her hand. "But this is what we've got. And I'm asking you to stay, Evelyn. Not forever, not with promises neither of us can keep. Just stay long enough to see if this could be real." She looked down at their joined hands like they were a puzzle she couldn't solve. "How long?" "I don't know. A month, 2, however long it takes to figure out if what we feel now survives actual daily life instead of crisis in proximity." "And my work in Boston? Write them. Explain you're extending this contract, that something here needs more attention. It's not even a lie. The implementation of those financial controls will go smoother with you overseeing them directly." That's a rationalization. "Yeah, it is. But it's also true." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "Stay, Evelyn. Please." She pulled her hand away, and his heart sank. But then she turned to look out the window at the ranch sprawling in morning light, and her expression shifted into something thoughtful. 2 months, she said quietly. "I'll stay 2 months. Help implement the controls properly, make sure the systems are working, verify the ranch operations are sound. At the end of that time, we reassess. No promises, no commitments beyond seeing if this is actually viable." 2 months, Silas agreed, relief flooding through him so intensely it was almost painful. "But I need my own space, not a guest room in your house. That's too complicated, too many assumptions built in. Is there anywhere else on the property I could stay?" He thought fast. "The old foreman's cabin. It's small, but it's got a stove, decent bed, separate from the main house. We used to put it up for traveling hands before we built the bunkhouse." "That would work." She met his eyes, and there was vulnerability there now, alongside the fear. "I mean this, Silas. 2 months to see if this is real or just loneliness and timing. After that, I make a decision based on reality, not hope." "Understood." "And we tell people this is a contract extension for implementation support. I won't have the hands gossiping about whatever this is." "Deal." They stood there in the kitchen with sunlight streaming through windows and the ghost of her departure slowly dissolving into possibility. Evelyn looked shaken, like she'd just agreed to something terrifying and couldn't quite believe her own decision. "I should send a telegram to Boston," she said. "Let them know I'm extending the engagement. I'll have Marcus prepare the cabin while you're in town." Silas hesitated. "You sure about this?" "No, but I haven't been sure about anything since I stepped off that stagecoach. So at least I'm consistent." A small, uncertain smile flickered across her face. 2 months, Silas. Don't make me regret this." "I'll do my best." She left for town in the wagon, trunk still packed but destination changed. Silas watched her go, then went to find Marcus and explain the new situation. His foreman listened with the kind of knowing expression that suggested none of this was surprising. Told you she'd stay if you asked. You didn't tell me she'd negotiate it like a business contract. Would you expect anything else from her? Marcus grinned. I'll get the cabin cleaned up. Probably needs airing out, fresh linens, that kind of thing. How much time do I have? She'll be back by evening. Do what you can. The foreman's cabin sat about 200 yards from the main house, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods that provided shade and privacy. It hadn't been used in over a year, and the interior showed the neglect, dust coating every surface, mouse droppings in the corners. The stove rusted from disuse. Silas and Marcus spent the afternoon transforming it from abandoned structure into something resembling habitable quarters. They swept and scrubbed, replaced the mattress ticking, got the stove operational again. Tommy brought over spare furniture from the bunkhouse, a decent chair, a small table, a lamp that actually worked. By the time Evelyn's wagon appeared on the road, the cabin looked almost welcoming. She examined it with the same critical eye she'd brought to the ranch ledgers, checking the stove, testing the bed frame, opening the shutters to assess the light. Silas waited outside, trying not to hover while she conducted her inspection. "It'll do?" she called finally. "Help me with the trunk?" They got her settled as the sun started its descent toward the horizon. Evelyn unpacked methodically. Clothes in the wardrobe, toiletries on the washstand, her leather satchel of papers and notebooks claiming the table as workspace. Making the space her own in small, deliberate ways. "I'll have someone bring meals from the main house," Silas offered. "Unless you'd rather eat with the hands in the bunkhouse. The house is fine. No need to change routines that work." She hung up the blue dress, brushing dust from the fabric. "I sent the telegram. My Boston contacts weren't happy about the delay, but they accepted the explanation." "What did you tell them?" "That the initial audit revealed systemic issues requiring extended oversight to resolve properly. All true, from a certain perspective. You're good at that. Finding the truth that serves multiple purposes. It's a useful skill in my profession." She turned to face him, and the vulnerability from earlier was locked away again behind professional competence. But it was still there underneath, just hidden. "Thank you for the cabin, for respecting that I needed separation." "You're welcome." They stood in the small space, suddenly awkward now that the immediate logistics were handled. This was new territory, not quite employer and auditor anymore, not yet whatever they were becoming. The uncertainty hung between them like smoke. "I should let you get settled," Silas said finally. "Supper's at 6 if you want to join us." "I'll be there." He left her to her unpacking, walking back to the main house with his head spinning. She'd stayed. Against every logical argument, against her own instincts, she'd agreed to stay and see if this could work. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the weight of what came next. 2 months to prove this wasn't just loneliness and timing. 2 months to build something real enough that when the deadline arrived, staying would be the obvious choice instead of the terrifying one. No pressure at all. That evening, Evelyn appeared at the house exactly at 6, wearing a plain work dress and her hair in that practical braid. She looked different somehow, less like an auditor conducting business, more like someone trying to figure out where she fit. They ate with Marcus joining them, the conversation carefully neutral. Ranch business, weather observations, nothing weighted or significant. But afterward, when Marcus had left and they were cleaning dishes, Evelyn said quietly, "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "This. Whatever we're attempting. I told you before, I'm not suited for traditional relationships. I don't know the rules, don't understand the expectations. The idea of trying terrifies me." Silas dried a plate slowly, choosing his words carefully. "We make our own rules. That's the whole point of trying something different. That's a nice theory with no practical application. So we figure out the application together. You need space. You've got the cabin. You need to work. The office is still yours. You want to help with the horses or ride out to check fence lines or bury yourself in ledgers for 16 hours. All of that's fine. We just see what works and adjust as we go. That's terrifyingly without structure." "Yeah, well, welcome to life outside a contract negotiation." He set down the towel. "Look, I'm not good at this either. Haven't tried since. Hasn't been anyone worth trying for in more years than I want to count. We're both making this up as we go, and we're both probably going to mess it up repeatedly, but that's better than not trying at all." She nodded slowly, still looking uncertain, but less panicked. 2 months. 2 months, he agreed. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Evelyn spent mornings in the office, creating detailed implementation guides for the financial controls she'd designed. Afternoons, she'd emerge, sometimes riding out with Silas to check on ranch operations, sometimes working with the hands on practical matters that benefited from her analytical mind. Evenings were spent in the main house, conversations over meals that gradually grew less careful, less guarded. She was, Silas discovered, relentlessly curious about how the ranch actually functioned beyond the numbers. She wanted to understand water management, grazing rotation, breeding decisions, all the practical knowledge that made the difference between survival and success in this brutal country. And she contributed too, spotting inefficiencies in supply chains, suggesting scheduling adjustments that made better use of available labor, applying her analytical skills to problems that had nothing to do with accounting. The hands adjusted to her presence faster than Silas expected. Tommy started asking her questions about mathematics, trying to improve his basic education. Marcus consulted her on supply orders, trusting her judgment about fair prices and reliable vendors. She earned respect through competence, the same way she'd earned it everywhere. But it was the quiet moments that mattered most. Evening conversations that stretched long after the meal was finished, sitting on the porch while darkness settled over the prairie. Working side by side in the office, the silence comfortable instead of awkward. Riding out to the south pasture and watching sunset paint the sky, impossible colors while their horses grazed nearby. Small things that added up to something larger than the sum of their parts. 3 weeks into the 2-month trial, Carl Mitchell rode up to the ranch looking agitated. Silas met him in the yard, Evelyn appearing from the office when she heard unfamiliar voices. "We've got a problem," Mitchell said without preamble. "The Dallas Land Company is threatening legal action if I don't pay the full purchase price they claim I still owe." "I thought the sale was completed." "So did I. But they're saying the deed transfer was conditional on payment of additional fees that weren't disclosed at the time of sale. Now they want another $800, or they're taking me to court." Evelyn had gone very still. "Let me see the paperwork." Mitchell handed over a thick envelope of legal documents. She scanned them rapidly, her expression darkening with each page. "This is extortion disguised as contract enforcement," she said finally. "These additional fees are fabricated charges with no basis in the original sale agreement. They're betting you can't afford a legal fight and will pay rather than risk losing everything." "Can they actually take the property?" "Not legally, but they can tie you up in court for months while the fees and legal costs mount. By the time it's resolved, you'll have lost more fighting than you would have paid in the fraudulent fees." She looked at Silas. "This is the same pattern I saw in the Henderson sale. The company sells distressed properties for inflated prices, then extracts additional money through legal intimidation after the fact." "How many other families have they done this to?" Silas asked. "Based on the pattern? Probably dozens. Small homesteaders, people who can't afford lawyers, families desperate enough to take risky opportunities." Evelyn's voice had gone cold with anger. "It's systematic fraud, and they're getting away with it because their victims can't fight back." Mitchell looked gutted. "So I just pay them? Let them steal another $800 on top of what they've already taken?" "No." Evelyn turned to Silas. "How many other families in this territory bought from the Dallas Company?" "At least 4 that I know of, probably more." "Then we document every fraudulent transaction, compile evidence of the systematic pattern, and take it to the territorial attorney. One family they can intimidate. Multiple families with coordinated evidence of fraud becomes a criminal case they can't ignore." "That'll take weeks," Mitchell protested. "They want payment in 10 days. Let them threaten. They won't actually file within that time frame because court scheduling takes longer than their deadline allows. It's a bluff designed to create panic." She looked at Silas again, something fierce and determined in her eyes. "But we need to move fast. Contact every family who bought from them. Get their documentation. Build the case before the company realizes what's happening." Silas recognized that expression. It was the same one she'd worn when exposing Jenkins's theft, when diagnosing Ranger's injury, when confronting uncomfortable truths. This was Evelyn in her element, fighting for justice with numbers and evidence as her weapons. "I'll ride out tomorrow. Talk to the other families," he said. "Marcus can hold things down here." "I'm coming with you." Not a request, a statement of fact. They spent the next week traveling between homesteads, collecting stories and documentation. Every family had a similar tale, promised one thing, delivered another, now being squeezed for additional money they couldn't afford. The evidence mounted into an undeniable pattern of systematic fraud. Evelyn organized it all with ruthless efficiency, creating a case file that laid out the company's methodology in devastating detail. Purchase agreements that contradicted deed specifications, survey maps that referenced non-existent landmarks, fee schedules that appeared after sales were completed. A dozen families robbed through carefully constructed legal deception. They delivered it to the territorial attorney in person, watching the man's expression shift from skepticism to anger as he reviewed the documentation. "This is thorough work," he said finally, looking at Evelyn with new respect. "You compiled all this?" "With Mr. Crowley's assistance. The pattern speaks for itself." "It does indeed. I'll need statements from the affected families, but with this evidence I can build a strong case for fraud charges against the company principals." He shuffled papers. "This could take months to prosecute, but the families are protected in the meantime. I'll file for an immediate injunction preventing any foreclosure or forced sale actions while the investigation proceeds. The company won't be able to collect those fees or take any properties." Mitchell, who'd ridden in with them, looked like he might cry from relief. "Thank you, both of you. I don't know how we can ever repay—" "You can repay us by helping your neighbors when they need it," Silas interrupted. "That's how communities survive out here. We look out for each other." On the ride back to the ranch, Evelyn was quiet, processing, calculating, doing whatever complex analysis happened in that sharp mind. The sun was setting by the time they reached familiar territory, painting the land in shades of gold and orange. "You were right," she said suddenly. "About what?" "About caring making you see things that matter beyond just the numbers. If I'd stayed detached, stayed purely analytical, I would have told Mitchell his only option was to pay or lose everything. I never would have thought to look for the larger pattern, to fight the company directly." She glanced at him. That wasn't the auditor responding. That was someone who got angry enough to want justice instead of just financial accuracy. "And that's a bad thing?" "I don't know. It's different, uncomfortable." She paused. "But also more satisfying than any audit I've completed in 10 years. They rode in silence for a while, the ranch buildings visible ahead. Silas thought about the families they'd helped, about Evelyn's fierce determination to build a case that could actually stop the fraud instead of just documenting it, about how naturally she'd slipped into the role of community advocate instead of detached professional. "Your 2 months are almost up," he said quietly. "I know. And I don't have an answer yet." Her voice was honest, vulnerable in a way that still caught him off guard. "Part of me wants to stay so badly it terrifies me, but part of me is still convinced this can't possibly work, that I'm deluding myself into thinking I can be someone I'm not." "You're not being someone you're not. You're just being yourself without all the armor you usually wear. The armor serves a purpose." "It did. Past tense. Now it's just keeping you from admitting you've found something worth staying for." She didn't answer, but her expression suggested she was thinking about it. They reached the ranch as full dark settled in, stabled the horses in comfortable silence. At the fork where the path split toward her cabin and the main house, Evelyn stopped. "I need time to think," she said, alone. "No discussions, no pressure, just time to figure out what I actually want versus what I'm scared of wanting." "How much time?" "A few days, maybe a week." She met his eyes in the darkness. "Can you give me that?" It was the hardest thing he'd agreed to, but Silas nodded. "Take what you need." She squeezed his hand briefly, then headed toward the cabin. He watched until the lamplight appeared in her window, then made himself walk to the main house instead of following the pull to go after her. The next week crawled by. Evelyn stayed mostly in her cabin or the office, working on something she wouldn't discuss. She joined meals but kept conversation superficial, clearly processing whatever internal debate was happening. Silas gave her space because he'd promised, but it was torture watching her withdraw into herself again. Marcus noticed, of course. "She's scared." "I know." "You gonna let fear win?" "I'm letting her make her own choice. That's different." "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, you're both so busy being terrified that you can't see what's obvious to everyone else on this ranch." "And what's that?" "That she's already made her choice. She's just fighting it because admitting she wants to stay means admitting she was wrong about not needing anyone. That's a hard thing to accept when you've built your whole identity around being self-sufficient." Silas wanted to argue, but Marcus was right. Evelyn wasn't deciding whether to stay. She was deciding whether she could forgive herself for wanting to. On the 8th day, she appeared at breakfast with a letter in her hand. She set it on the table between them, expression carefully neutral. I wrote to my Boston contacts, gave formal notice that I'm relocating my practice to Texas territory and will only accept contracts in this region going forward. Silas stared at the letter, afraid to hope. You're staying. I'm trying to stay. There's a difference. She sat down across from him. I can't promise this will work. I can't guarantee I won't panic in 6 months and run back to what feels safe. But I want to try. Actually try, not just test it with arbitrary deadlines and escape clauses built in. What changed your mind? That family with the 3 children, the Johnsons. Remember them? She wrapped her hands around a coffee cup. The wife cried when we told them about the injunction, said she'd been praying for a miracle because she couldn't bear to tell her kids they were losing their home. And I realized I've spent 15 years being proud of my detachment, my ability to stay objective and uninvolved. But for the first time, being involved felt better than being right. Evelyn, let me finish. I'm staying because this work matters more when it's connected to actual people instead of abstract clients. I'm staying because you make me want to be braver than I've ever been. I'm staying because somewhere in the last 2 months, this stopped being a ranch I was auditing and became a home I'm terrified of losing. Her voice caught slightly. But I need you to understand. I don't know how to be someone's partner. I'm going to make mistakes, push you away when I'm scared, retreat into work when emotions get overwhelming. It won't be easy. I don't want easy. I want real. And you're the most real thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember. She smiled then, tentative but genuine. 2 terrified people trying to build something neither of us knows how to create. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, Silas said honestly. And that's exactly why it might work. They sat there in the kitchen with morning light streaming through windows. 2 people who'd both spent years hiding behind walls finally brave enough to try something different. It wasn't a perfect moment. Evelyn still looked scared. Silas still felt uncertain. Nothing was resolved except the decision to try. But sometimes trying was enough. Outside, the ranch was waking up to another brutal Texas day. Horses needed feeding, fences needed mending, 100 daily tasks demanding attention. But for this moment, Silas let all of that wait while he sat across from a woman who'd walked into his life in a dusty blue dress and changed everything he thought he knew about trust and partnership, and the difference between staying safe and actually living. She'd broken all his rules in one morning and spent 2 months showing him that the rules were the problem, not the solution. Now they'd build something new together. No guarantees, no certainty, just 2 people stubborn enough to believe they could create something better than what they'd known before. It was terrifying and possible in equal measure, exactly like everything worth having. The first real fight happened 3 months after Evelyn decided to stay, and it was spectacular in its stupidity. Silas had hired 2 new hands without consulting her, despite the fact that she'd been managing the payroll and staffing budgets for weeks. She found out when the men showed up for their first day, and Marcus sent them to her for paperwork. Who authorized this, she asked, appearing in the south paddock where Silas was working with a temperamental mare. I did. We need the extra help with fall roundup coming. And you didn't think to mention it. We discussed the budget last week. There was no allocation for additional staff. It's my ranch, Evelyn. I don't need permission to hire people. The words came out sharper than intended, defensive in a way that had nothing to do with the actual hiring and everything to do with feeling like he was losing control of his own operation. But the damage was done. Evelyn's expression went cold and professional, the walls slamming back into place. Of course, my mistake thinking we were partners in this. She turned on her heel. I'll adjust the books accordingly. She didn't speak to him for 2 days. Slept in her cabin, took meals alone, buried herself in work with the kind of intensity that meant she was furious and hurt in equal measure. Silas knew he'd screwed up, knew the issue wasn't really about hiring but about respect and communication. But his own stubborn pride kept him from apologizing immediately. Marcus finally cornered him in the barn on the 3rd day. You gonna fix this or just let it fester until she leaves? She's not leaving over a hiring disagreement. No, she's leaving because you treated her like an employee instead of a partner, and she's remembering all the reasons she convinced herself staying was a mistake. Marcus leaned against a stall door. Pride's an expensive luxury when you're trying to build something with someone, boss. I know. Then act like it. Silas found her in the office that evening, working by lamplight even though the hour was late. She didn't look up when he entered. I was wrong, he said without preamble. Not about needing the hands, we do need them, but about not discussing it with you first. You've been managing those budgets, making them actually work for the first time in years. I should have respected that instead of making unilateral decisions like, your input doesn't matter. Evelyn set down her pen slowly. This isn't going to work if you only include me in decisions when it's convenient. Either I'm part of running this ranch, or I'm just the woman who does your accounting. You need to decide which. I know which I want. Getting used to actually having a partner is harder than I thought it would be. You think it's easy for me? Her voice rose slightly. I've spent 15 years answering to no one, making every decision independently. Now I have to consider your opinions, your needs, your plans. It's terrifying and exhausting, and I'm constantly afraid I'm doing it wrong. You're not doing it wrong. Neither are you. We're both just learning as we go, making mistakes, trying to figure out how two independent people build something together. She rubbed her eyes. But we have to actually talk to each other, Silas. Not just when there's a crisis, but about the daily decisions that keep this place running. You're right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry too, for shutting you out instead of talking about why I was upset. She stood, moving around the desk. We can't keep falling into these patterns. You making decisions alone, me retreating when I'm hurt. That's just us repeating old survival mechanisms that don't work anymore. They talked until midnight. Actually talked instead of just circling around the real issues. It was uncomfortable and awkward and necessary. By the time Evelyn headed back to her cabin, they'd agreed on new systems for major decisions, better communication about ranch operations, ways to avoid this particular landmine in the future. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The territorial attorney's case against the Dallas Land Company took nearly 8 months to work through the legal system. Evelyn testified twice, her organized documentation proving crucial to establishing the pattern of fraud. When the verdict finally came down, guilty on multiple counts, restitution ordered for all affected families, she was in the ranch office reviewing quarterly accounts. Silas brought her the news, watching her face transform from focused concentration to fierce satisfaction. They're paying back every dollar? She asked. Plus penalties and legal fees. Some of the company principals are facing jail time. She leaned back in her chair, something like wonder crossing her features. We actually won. You won. That case wouldn't have existed without your work. It wouldn't have happened without you convincing those families to trust us with their documentation, or writing out to collect statements when I was too buried in organizing the evidence. She shook her head. This is what partnership looks like, isn't it? Not one person doing everything, but each contributing what they're good at towards something neither could accomplish alone. Took us long enough to figure that out. We're slow learners. But she was smiling, and Silas felt something settle in his chest that had been restless since she'd arrived. This was working, messy and imperfect and requiring constant adjustment, but actually working. Word spread about Evelyn's role in the case. Other ranchers started seeking her advice on financial matters, contract reviews, suspicions of fraud. She took on selective clients, building a practice that kept her engaged without overwhelming her. The office became hers in a way that felt permanent. Files organized according to systems only she understood, reference materials she'd ordered from back east, the particular smell of her ink and paper mixing with leather and tobacco that had always defined the space. Silas watched her transform the ranch's operations with the same analytical precision she'd brought to the original audit. She renegotiated supplier contracts, saving them nearly 30% on feed costs. Found buyers for their cattle that paid premium prices because she researched market conditions instead of accepting whatever the local broker offered. Caught a boundary dispute with a neighboring property before it became expensive litigation, resolving it through careful survey verification and diplomatic negotiation. The ranch prospered in ways that had nothing to do with luck or good weather, and everything to do with having someone who understood that success came from details most people ignored. But it was the small domestic rhythms that surprised Silas most. How naturally Evelyn fit into daily life once she stopped fighting it. She'd take morning coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise with the same appreciation he'd always felt for this land. She'd ride out with him to check on distant pastures, her observations about cattle health, and grazing patterns proving as sharp as her financial analysis. She taught Tommy advanced mathematics in the evenings, patiently explaining concepts the boy would never have encountered otherwise. And slowly, carefully, she moved from the foreman's cabin into the main house. Not all at once, not with dramatic declarations, just gradually keeping more of her things in the guest room, staying over more nights than not, until one day Silas realized she hadn't slept in the cabin in over a month, and neither of them had discussed it. "Should probably do something about that cabin," Marcus mentioned one afternoon. "Been sitting empty for a while now."
"Yeah," Silas agreed, trying not to smile too obviously. "Guess we should." They were in the kitchen one evening, Evelyn cooking while Silas handled the accounts, roles reversed from when she'd first arrived. When she said casually, "The Johnsons want to sell their property," asked if we'd be interested in buying. "We've got enough land."
True, but their water access could solve the shortage problem we have in the southeast pasture during dry summers. And the purchase price is fair. They're not trying to gouge us, just want to move closer to family back east. Silas looked up from the ledger. "You've already analyzed the numbers, haven't you?" "Of course I have. We could finance the purchase through the cattle sale proceeds from fall roundup, keep the existing structures for additional worker housing, and expand our grazing rotation to include their better grassland." She stirred something on the stove. "But it's a major investment, not a decision to make lightly." "What do you think we should do?" "I think the ranch can support it financially, and strategically it positions us better for long-term growth. But I also think you need to decide if you want to expand or if you're happy with what we have now." She glanced at him. Not every opportunity needs to be seized just because it's available. He considered this, thinking about what the ranch had been when he and James started versus what it was now. They'd always talked about expanding, building something significant. But James was gone, and the driving need to prove something through sheer size had faded. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want whatever lets us build something sustainable, big enough to be secure, small enough to manage well. The Johnson property fits that vision without overextending us." She served up dinner, setting plates on the table. "But I'm not the only one making this decision. They bought the property. The negotiation was straightforward. The Johnsons, grateful to sell to people they knew, would treat the land well. Evelyn structured the financing in ways that protected their cash reserves while still allowing for the purchase. Within 6 months, they'd integrated the new acreage seamlessly into ranch operations, and the southeast pasture never ran dry again. It was working with the Mitchells on a water-sharing agreement that led to the next significant change. Carl had become a reliable neighbor, his son David proving competent with livestock management. They were in the Mitchell barn discussing irrigation schedules when David mentioned that a traveling doctor had passed through the previous week, heading toward the territorial capital. "Said this whole region is underserved for medical care," David commented. "Nearest real doctor is 3 days' ride for most families out here." Evelyn had gone very still. "What kind of doctor?" "General practice, I think. Young fellow, seemed capable, but he wasn't interested in settling down, just passing through." On the ride back, she was quiet, processing something, working through an idea in that systematic way of hers. Silas let her think, knowing she'd share when ready. "What if we brought in a doctor?" she said finally. "Permanent position, based somewhere central where families could actually reach medical care without losing days of travel." "That's an ambitious thought." "It's a practical one. How many people have we lost out here because injuries or illnesses that could have been treated turned fatal due to lack of care? How many women die in childbirth because there's no skilled help available?" Her voice carried the same fierce determination he'd heard when she was building the fraud case. "We've got land, resources, community standing. We could make this happen." "Where would this doctor even stay?" "We don't have anything suitable. We build something. Small clinic with living quarters attached, located somewhere accessible to multiple homesteads. Fund it through community contribution. Every family pays what they can afford annually. Ensures the doctor has stable income regardless of individual ability to pay per visit." Silas looked at her, seeing the spark of purpose that made her most formidable. "You've already worked out the financial model, haven't you? Rough estimates. Need more detailed planning, but the concept is sound." She met his eyes. "This is what we could do with the prosperity the ranch generates. Not just build our own wealth, but improve the whole region." It took 9 months to make it happen. Evelyn organized the funding with the same precision she brought to everything. convincing neighboring ranchers and homesteaders to contribute based on their means, structuring an annual support system that guaranteed the doctor a livable wage. They built the clinic on neutral ground between several properties, close enough to water and the main road for accessibility. Finding a doctor willing to relocate to frontier territory proved harder than the logistics. 3 candidates turned them down before a young physician named Samuel Chen arrived from San Francisco, drawn by the opportunity to serve an underserved community and the guaranteed salary that removed financial pressure from his medical decisions. The clinic opened on a cold November morning, and within a week had treated everything from a broken arm to a difficult birth that would have killed both mother and child without intervention. Evelyn kept the books for the clinic pro bono, ensuring the community contributions were managed properly and the doctor had what he needed. Silas watched her throw herself into this project with the same intensity she'd brought to exposing fraud and saving the ranch. This was who she was underneath all the professional armor, someone who saw problems and couldn't rest until she'd built solutions. "You're going to exhaust yourself," he told her one night, finding her reviewing clinic supply orders past midnight. "Probably. But it matters." "I know it does. That's why I'm not actually trying to stop you, just reminding you to sleep occasionally." She smiled, tired but satisfied. "We did something good here. Not just for us, but for everyone. That feels better than any amount of money I've ever recovered in an audit." James would have loved this. He always talked about the ranch being part of a larger community, not just an isolated operation. He sounds like he was a wise man. He was. And he'd have liked you, I think. Would have appreciated how you turned his concerns about the ranch finances into something that actually made this place better. Evelyn reached for his hand across the desk. "I wish I could have met him. Thanked him for hiring me despite knowing he might not live to see the results. He knew what he was doing. Even dying, he was trying to protect what we'd built." Silas squeezed her fingers. "But he also gave me something more valuable than just exposing the theft. He gave me you." "That's sentimental." "Yeah, well, you're stuck with me. Sentiment comes with the package." 2 years after Evelyn had stepped off that stagecoach, they were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Marcus stood as witness, along with half the territory's ranching families who'd become friends through the clinic project and the land fraud case. Evelyn wore a dress that wasn't blue for once, deep green that matched the cottonwoods in summer, and Silas managed not to stumble over his vows despite being more nervous than he'd been facing down armed claim jumpers. They didn't change much after the ceremony. Evelyn kept her own name professionally, continued running her auditing practice alongside managing ranch finances. Silas still made decisions about livestock and land management, but consulted her on anything with financial implications. They fought occasionally, usually about communication failures or stubborn independence reasserting itself, but they'd learned to talk through it instead of retreating into old patterns. The ranch continued to prosper. Not just financially, though the book showed consistent growth that would have shocked Silas from 5 years earlier, but in ways that mattered more. Respect from neighbors, loyalty from the hands, a reputation for fair dealing that brought opportunities their way. When Carl Mitchell's health started failing, David came to them about buying the property. Not because they'd pressured him, but because he trusted them to honor his father's legacy while also giving him the freedom to pursue other opportunities. They negotiated terms that worked for everyone, and the Mitchell land became part of Crowley Ranch through agreement rather than acquisition. Evelyn was the one who suggested they needed help managing the expanded operation. Not just ranch hands, but someone with business sense who could handle day-to-day financial operations while she focused on strategic planning and her outside auditing work. "You're talking about hiring someone to do your job," Silas pointed out. "I'm talking about hiring someone to do part of my job so I'm not working 16-hour days and we actually have time together." She sorted through applications they'd received. Besides, training someone in proper financial management means these systems survive beyond us. That matters. They hired a young man from back east, recent business school graduate looking for opportunity and willing to learn. Evelyn trained him with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, creating systems and documentation that could outlast any individual person's involvement. It was watching her teach someone else the work she'd once guarded so carefully that made Silas realize how much she'd changed. The woman who'd arrived insisting she worked alone, trusted no one, kept herself carefully separate from emotional involvement. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who built communities, mentored younger workers, invested herself in causes that mattered. "You turned into the kind of person you once told me you'd never be," he mentioned one evening. "What kind is that?" "Someone who lets people matter, who stays in one place and builds something permanent instead of moving from job to job. Who cares more about impact than independence?" Evelyn considered this. "I suppose I did. Turns out I was wrong about what I needed to be happy." A lot of that going around. "You changed too, you know. The man who had 3 iron rules about women on his property now has a wife who runs half the operation and revolutionized the entire territory's approach to community health care. Guess we both learned something about the difference between protecting ourselves and actually living." It was Marcus who first suggested they should think about succession planning. The foreman was getting older, talking about retirement, and the question of what happened to the ranch long term couldn't be avoided forever. "You two planning on having kids?" he asked bluntly one afternoon. Silas nearly choked on his coffee. "That's a hell of a question. It's a practical one. You're building something here, ranch, clinic, community infrastructure. Someone's got to carry it forward when you're gone. Either you raise them yourselves or you start thinking about other options." After Marcus left, Silas found Evelyn in the office. "Did Marcus ask you about children?" "Yes, this morning." She didn't look up from her work. "I told him it was none of his business, but he made a fair point about long-term planning. What do you think?" "I think I'm 41 years old and never imagined myself as a mother. I think we're both set in our ways and children would disrupt everything we've built. I think the logistics of pregnancy and infant care while running a ranch and auditing practice sound exhausting." She set down her pen. "I also think I'd like to try, if you would." "Yeah," Silas said, his chest tight with hope and terror in equal measure. "Yeah, I would." Their daughter was born 18 months later, during a spring storm that made getting to the clinic impossible. Dr. Chen came to the ranch instead, guiding Evelyn through a labor that terrified Silas more than anything he'd faced in 47 years of hard living. But when he held that tiny, furious creature who'd inherited her mother's determination and lung capacity, something in him that had been closed since James died finally opened back up. They named her Sarah, after Evelyn's mother. She was not an easy child, strong-willed from birth, opinionated before she could talk properly, curious about everything in ways that regularly gave her parents heart attacks. But she was also brilliant and funny and possessed the same fierce sense of justice that had driven Evelyn to expose fraud and build a clinic. 2 years later came the son they named James, quieter than his sister but just as sharp. He had Silas's patience with animals and Evelyn's head for numbers, a combination that suggested he'd either be spectacular or spectacularly difficult as he grew. The ranch adapted to having children in ways neither parent expected. The hands became protective uncles, teaching both kids to ride and rope before they were old enough for school. Dr. Chen treated their inevitable injuries with professional competence and personal concern. The Johnson family, still in the area, sent their own children over for playdates that usually ended with someone muddy, bruised, and completely happy. Evelyn cut back her external auditing work, but never stopped completely. She took cases that interested her, traveled occasionally for complex investigations, but always came back to the ranch that had become home. Her office remained her sanctuary, but now it was often invaded by children wanting help with arithmetic or just to be near their mother while she worked. Silas watched her teach Sarah to understand account ledgers at age 7, explaining profit and loss with the same seriousness she'd bring to adult clients. Watched James learn to spot inconsistencies in numbers before he could fully write his own name. They were raising children who understood that financial literacy was survival skill, that justice required both courage and documentation, that community responsibility mattered as much as personal success. "We're creating tiny versions of ourselves," he mentioned to Evelyn one evening, watching the kids argue about proper fence maintenance techniques. Terrifying, isn't it? Absolutely, but also kind of amazing. The territorial attorney who'd prosecuted the land fraud case eventually moved to the state capital, but he maintained contact with Evelyn, consulted her on complex financial investigations, recommended her to other attorneys dealing with fraud cases. Her reputation spread beyond the immediate territory. The auditor who'd exposed systematic land fraud, who'd built a community healthcare system, who could find money hidden in ways that seemed impossible. She was offered positions back east multiple times, prestigious firms, significant salaries, the kind of career advancement she'd once dreamed about. She turned them all down without hesitation. "Boston feels like a different life," she told Silas when he asked about the latest offer. "Like someone I used to be but don't recognize anymore. Everything that matters is here." It was the water dispute that tested everything they'd built. A large ranching operation from out of state bought land adjacent to their southern boundary, immediately claiming water rights that would have cut off access for half a dozen smaller homesteads. The legal situation was complex. The new operation had significant financial resources, and fighting them would be expensive and possibly futile. Most of the affected homesteaders couldn't afford legal representation. They came to Crowley Ranch because everyone knew Evelyn understood contracts, and Silas had a reputation for standing up to powerful interests. "We can't take this on alone," Evelyn said, reviewing the water rights documentation. "This isn't like the land fraud case where we had clear evidence of wrongdoing. This is interpretation of century-old territorial law and competing claims that could be argued either way. So we let them steal water from families who've been here for generations?" "I didn't say that. I said we can't do it alone." She looked at him with that expression he'd learned meant she was planning something significant. "We need to organize. All the affected properties, coordinated legal strategy, pooled resources for proper representation. Make this about community rights versus corporate acquisition, not individual disputes." It took 6 months of organizing, fundraising, legal research, and community meetings. Evelyn coordinated the financial aspects while Silas handled the practical politics of keeping a dozen independent ranchers working together instead of fragmenting into individual negotiations. They hired lawyers from Denver who specialized in water rights, expert witnesses who could testify about historical usage patterns, surveyors who documented every claim in exhaustive detail. The case went to territorial court, then to appeals when they lost the first ruling. Evelyn testified about historical financial records that proved water usage patterns going back decades. Silas testified about the practical realities of ranching in this region without adequate water access. Neighbors testified about their families' histories, their investments in this land, the communities they'd built around shared resources. They won on the third appeal, a ruling that established precedent for community water rights versus individual claim acquisition. The victory didn't just protect the immediate homesteads, it changed how water disputes would be handled across the territory for generations. But it had cost them. Legal fees that drained reserves, even with community cost sharing, time away from the ranch and their children. Stress that manifested in short tempers and exhausted conversations. The night the final ruling came down, Evelyn collapsed into bed and slept for 14 hours straight. "Was it worth it?" Silas asked when she finally woke. "Ask me in 20 years when Sarah and James are running this ranch and still have water access because we fought for it now." She rolled over to face him. "Yes, it was worth it, but I'm also completely exhausted and never want to see another legal filing as long as I live." "Fair enough. At least not for a few months." He laughed because, of course, she couldn't actually stop. This was who she was, someone who saw injustice and couldn't walk away, who used her considerable skills to fight battles most people couldn't win on their own. It had transformed the territory they lived in, built structures that served entire communities, created precedents that protected people who came after. It had also built a partnership stronger than anything Silas had imagined possible when he'd first seen her step off that stagecoach. They'd fought together, built together, raised children together, created something that was bigger than either of them alone could have managed. The ranch hands threw a party when the water rights victory was confirmed. Half the territory showed up, turning the ranch into something between a celebration and a community meeting. Evelyn moved through the crowd with Sarah on her hip, accepting congratulations with the same reserved grace she brought to everything. But Silas saw her smile when the Johnson family thanked her, saw the satisfaction in her eyes when Dr. Chen toasted to community cooperation. She'd found what she'd been looking for without knowing she was searching for it. Not just a home, but a purpose that connected her analytical skills to actual human impact. Not just a partner, but a true equal who valued her mind as much as her heart. Not just survival, but a life worth the terror of actually committing to something permanent. Later, when the crowd had dispersed and the children were asleep, they sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The same view Silas had watched alone for 15 years before Evelyn arrived, but somehow completely different now. "No regrets?" he asked. "About what specifically?" "There's a long list of questionable decisions to choose from. About staying, about all of this. She leaned against him, tired but content. Not a single one. Turns out you were right about the difference between staying safe and actually living. Took us both a while to figure that out. Some lessons take time, but we got there eventually. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned to build something together despite having no idea how when they started. The ranch spread out around them in the darkness, more than just land and cattle now. It was home, community, legacy, everything they'd created through stubborn determination and the willingness to keep trying even when easier options existed. Think the kids will want this someday? Evelyn asked. The ranch, the responsibility, all of it? I think Sarah will want to revolutionize something, and James will want to quietly make it work better. Whether that's here or somewhere else, we'll support them either way. Look at you being evolved about succession planning. I learned from someone who taught me that holding on too tight destroys what you're trying to protect. She smiled in the darkness. You learned that yourself. I just provided evidence. The territory continued changing around them. The railroad finally pushed through, making travel easier and markets more accessible. The clinic expanded to include a second doctor and a trained nurse. Small towns grew into larger ones, bringing both opportunity and complication. But through all of it, Crowley Ranch remained a constant, well-run, profitable, respected throughout the region for fair dealing and community investment. Silas and Evelyn aged into the work they'd built, their partnership deepening with each challenge overcome and each success shared. They never stopped disagreeing, never stopped having to work through the inevitable friction of two strong-willed people building a life together. But they'd learned to fight fair, to apologize when wrong, to value the relationship over being right. They'd also learned to recognize when stubbornness was actually conviction worth defending and when it was just fear wearing a disguise. On their 10th anniversary, Marcus gave them a gift, a framed copy of James's original letter hiring Evelyn, preserved and mounted with care. Silas hung it in the office where it all began, a reminder of the moment everything changed. Your brother knew what he was doing, Evelyn said, studying the familiar handwriting. He did. Even dying, he was trying to save more than just the ranch finances. Think he knew it would turn out like this? I think he hoped. That's all any of us can do. Hope we're making decisions that lead somewhere better than where we started. They stood in the office where she'd first spread out ledgers and exposed theft, where they'd argued and planned and slowly learned to trust each other. The same space, but transformed by time and shared purpose into something neither could have created alone. We did all right, Silas said quietly. We did better than all right. We built something that matters. And they had. Not perfect, never easy, but real in ways that transcended the original transaction of auditor and client. They'd taken broken pieces, his grief and isolation, her loneliness and fear of permanence, and constructed something whole, something that served not just themselves, but an entire community that was better for their partnership. Outside, the ranch continued its eternal rhythms, horses in the stable, cattle in the pasture, hands finishing evening chores before heading to the bunkhouse. The same work that had defined this place for decades, but infused now with purpose beyond mere survival. This was what happened when two people chose courage over comfort, partnership over independence, building together over the safety of staying separate. It was messy and complicated and required constant work. It was also everything worth having. 15 years after that first stagecoach arrival, Silas stood at the ranch gate watching the sunrise and thinking about how much could change while the land stayed constant. The ritual had become tradition. Every June 14th, he came out here at dawn to remember the morning Evelyn Hart had walked into his life and dismantled everything he'd thought he needed to survive. The gate itself was different now. Stronger construction, better materials, a sign that read, Crowley Ranch, established 1868, that Sarah had designed for his 60th birthday. His daughter was 17 now, sharp as her mother and twice as stubborn, currently away at a Denver business school learning advanced accounting. She wrote weekly letters filled with complaints about inefficient professors and excitement about new financial theories she wanted to implement on the ranch. James was 15, already taller than Silas, and showing the kind of quiet competence that reminded everyone of his namesake uncle. He was in the south pasture right now with Marcus's replacement, a capable young foreman named Diego,
who'd learned ranch management under the old master before Marcus finally retired to town. Everything changed. Everything stayed the same.
Footsteps on the gravel made him turn. Evelyn approached with 2 cups of coffee, her hair more silver than dark now, but her eyes just as sharp. She'd cut it shorter a few years back, practical and no nonsense, though Sarah had mourned the loss of what she called Mama's audit braid. "You're thinking too hard," Evelyn said, handing him a cup. "I can see it from the house." Just remembering.
Dangerous habit at our age. But she leaned against the fence beside him, their shoulders touching in the easy intimacy of long partnership. "Though I suppose today warrants it. 15 years since you stepped off that stagecoach planning to stay 3 weeks and leave. 15 years since you gave me 3 rules I broke before lunch." She sipped her coffee. "We were both so certain we knew what we needed. And both completely wrong."
"Not completely. We needed safety. We just had terrible ideas about what actual safety looked like." She gestured toward the ranch spread out in morning light. "This is safety. Knowing someone has your back even when you're being an idiot. Building something that outlasts your mistakes." Silas smiled because she was right, and because even after 15 years she could still surprise him with moments of pure honesty that cut through every defense. They'd both learned that real safety wasn't about walls or rules or keeping people at distance. It was about finding someone strong enough to weather your worst and stubborn enough to stay anyway. "Sarah wrote," Evelyn continued, "apparently her professor said women shouldn't handle complex financial negotiations because we're too emotional." She corrected him with a 15-minute presentation on historical female financial advisors and their success rates versus male counterparts. How'd he take it? Poorly, according to her letter, but the other students applauded, so she considers it a victory. She's going to revolutionize something someday, or get expelled trying. Probably both. Evelyn's voice carried the same mix of pride and exasperation that characterized most discussions about their daughter. She asked about taking over the ranch auditing practice when she graduates, wants to expand it into a full financial consulting firm serving the entire territory. What did you tell her? That we'd discuss it when she actually has the degree and some practical experience. That building something sustainable takes time and patience, not just brilliant ideas and aggressive confidence. She paused. Though between us, I think she could absolutely do it. She's better with numbers than I was at her age, and she's got the personality to handle difficult clients. She got that from you? The personality or the financial skill? Both. Plus your complete inability to back down when you know you're right. Evelyn laughed, the sound warm and genuine. I seem to recall you having similar stubbornness issues when we met. Still do. Just learn to recognize when I'm being stubborn about the wrong things. They finished their coffee as the sun climbed higher, painting the ranch in shades of gold that made everything look almost dreamlike. Silas thought about the man he'd been 15 years ago, isolated, defensive, hiding behind rules that protected nothing but his own fear. That man would barely recognize the life he had now. Marcus wants to come for dinner tonight, Evelyn mentioned. Says he's got something to discuss. He retired 3 years ago. What could he possibly need to discuss?
Knowing Marcus, either genuine ranch business or elaborate excuse to meddle in our lives. Could go either way. Marcus arrived that evening with his wife Clara, both of them looking well-fed and content in retirement. They'd moved to town when Marcus's knees finally gave out from decades of hard work, but he stayed connected to the ranch through regular visits and unsolicited advice that was usually correct. Over dinner, Evelyn's cooking had never gotten particularly good, but it was edible and made with ingredients from their own land, which felt important. Marcus cleared his throat in the way that meant he was about to say something significant. Diego's thinking about leaving, he announced. Got offered a position managing a bigger operation up north. Better pay, more responsibility. Silas felt his stomach drop. Diego had been with them for 5 years, had learned the ranch inside and out, had earned the trust of hands and neighbors alike. Losing him would be a serious blow. When? Evelyn asked, already shifting into practical problem-solving mode. Month or so. He wanted to give proper notice, help find a replacement. Marcus leaned back in his chair, which brings me to my actual point. James is ready. James is 15 years old. I was working full ranch hand duties at 14.
Diego was managing livestock operations at 16. Age isn't the issue. Capability is. And that boy knows this ranch better than anyone except you two. He's got the temperament for leadership, the respect of the hands, and the sense to ask for help when he needs it. Marcus, Silas started, hear me out. I'm not saying make him foreman tomorrow. I'm saying start training him seriously. Let him shadow Diego for the next month. Learn the administrative side. Give him real authority over specific operations. Let him make actual decisions and live with the consequences. By the time he's 17, 18, he could step into that role properly. Evelyn was quiet, which meant she was actually considering it instead of dismissing it outright. Silas knew that look, wheels turning, calculating possibilities and risks with the same precision she brought to financial analysis. He hasn't said anything about wanting that responsibility, she pointed out, because he's waiting for you to offer it instead of assuming. Kids respectful like that. Marcus accepted more coffee from Clara. But I've watched him work. He's got the gift for it, same as his uncle did. Be ashamed to waste that because you're not ready to admit your children are growing up. The words stung because they were accurate. Silas and Evelyn had spent years building this ranch into something that could be passed down, but actually beginning that transition felt like admitting their own time was finite, that the generation they'd raised was ready to start taking over the work they'd defined themselves by. I'll talk to him, Silas said finally. See if it's something he wants before we make decisions about his future. Fair enough, but don't wait too long. Opportunities like Diego's departure don't come around often. Good training moment without the pressure of immediate crisis. After Marcus and Clara left, Silas found James in the barn checking on a mare about to foal. The boy looked up as he approached, concern immediate. Something wrong?
No, just wanted to talk. Silas leaned against the stall door, watching his son's careful attention to the horse. Diego's leaving, got offered better pay managing a bigger place. James's expression showed genuine regret. That's rough. He's good at what he does. He is, which means we need to think about replacement. Silas paused, choosing words carefully. Marcus thinks you're ready to start training for the foreman position. The boy went very still, hands pausing in their gentle examination of the mare. I'm 15. You are. You're also more capable than most men twice your age, and you know this ranch better than anyone we could hire from outside. Silas moved closer. But this isn't about what Marcus thinks or what I think. Question is what you want, because if you'd rather go to school like your sister or try something different, that's fine too. Your life doesn't have to be defined by this ranch just because you were born to it. James was quiet for a long moment, his attention returning to the horse. Finally he said, I like it here. Like the work, the land, the way everything connects into something larger than individual pieces. Sarah's brilliant with numbers and theories, but I understand dirt and water and how to make things grow. This feels right to me in ways I can't explain but also can't deny. That's not really an answer to my question. Yes. The word came out clear and certain. I want to learn the foreman position. Want to understand how to run this place properly so when you and Mama are ready to step back, it continues being what you built instead of falling apart because I didn't know what I was doing. Pride swelled in Silas's chest, fierce and overwhelming. This was his son, not a copy of himself or James or anyone else, but his own person choosing his own path. A path that happened to align with the ranch, but chosen freely rather than assumed through obligation. It's hard work, he warned. Harder than regular ranch hand duties because you're responsible for everyone's safety and the operation's success. You'll make mistakes that affect people's livelihoods. You'll have to fire friends and negotiate with difficult personalities and make decisions knowing some people will disagree no matter what you choose. I know, I've watched you and Mama do it for 15 years. James met his eyes, and there was maturity there that hadn't been visible yesterday. But I've also watched you build something that matters to people beyond just yourselves. That's what I want to learn. Not just how to run a ranch, but how to run it in ways that serve the whole community. Silas pulled his son into a rough hug, the kind of physical affection that had become easier over the years of being Evelyn's partner and raising children who demanded emotional availability. Then we'll start training tomorrow. Diego can teach you the administrative side. I'll handle the practical leadership aspects, and your mother will make sure you understand the financial implications of every decision. Sounds terrifying. It will be, but you'll be good at it. The next month was intense.
James shadowed Diego constantly, learning scheduling systems, personnel management, supply coordination, all the invisible work that kept a ranch functioning. Evelyn taught him advanced bookkeeping in the evenings, making sure he understood how operational decisions translated to financial outcomes. Silas took him through difficult conversations, disciplining hands who weren't performing, negotiating with suppliers, handling disputes between workers. The boy absorbed it all with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He made mistakes, of course, scheduled 2 crews for the same task while leaving another short-handed, miscalculated supply needs, and had to make emergency orders. Initially struggled with confronting men twice his age about poor work. But he learned from each failure, adjusted his approach, got better with practice. By the time Diego actually left, James wasn't ready to take over completely. That would take another year or 2 of experience. But he was ready to start carrying real responsibility, and the hands respected him enough to follow his leadership on specific projects. "We're raising competent humans," Evelyn observed one evening, watching James organize the next day's work assignments with careful attention to each hand's strengths and the tasks that needed completion. "Terrifying, isn't it?" "Absolutely, but also kind of wonderful." She leaned against him, tired from a long day reviewing accounts for a fraud case 3 territories over. "Think we did all right with them?" "I think we gave them skills to build their own lives, whether that's here or somewhere else. Can't ask for more than that." "I can. I want them to be happy, fulfilled, surrounded by people who value them for who they are rather than what they can provide." She paused. "But I suppose those things can't be given, only discovered." "You sound like someone who learned that the hard way." "We both did." That was true enough. Silas thought about the rules he'd built around his life before Evelyn, the walls that had protected him from pain but also from anything meaningful. He'd thought safety meant isolation, the control required rigid structure, the trusting people inevitably led to betrayal. All of it wrong, all of it understandable given what he'd survived, but wrong nonetheless. Real safety came from partnership with someone strong enough to challenge you. Real control meant knowing when to delegate and trust others' competence. Real trust required vulnerability that terrified you but proved worthwhile when people rose to meet it. These were lessons that couldn't be taught, only lived. He and Evelyn had stumbled through learning them together, making every possible mistake along the way. But they'd survived the stumbling, and that survival had built something more durable than perfection ever could have achieved. Sarah came home for Christmas that year with her business degree completed and a job offer from a prestigious Denver firm. She announced this over dinner with the same matter-of-fact delivery Evelyn used for significant news, waiting for their reactions. "That's a good opportunity," Evelyn said carefully. "Respected firm, challenging work, excellent professional development." "It is," Sarah agreed. "I'd be working with some of the best financial minds in the region, handling complex cases that would teach me things I could never learn in a smaller practice." "But," Silas heard the unspoken qualification, "but I'd also be doing it for someone else's benefit, building someone else's reputation, serving clients who see me as interchangeable with any other competent analyst." She set down her fork. "Whereas if I stayed here, I could expand Mama's practice into something significant, while also serving communities that actually need the help. The work matters more out here because the stakes are real for people with fewer resources." "The pay would be substantially less," Evelyn pointed out. "Denver firm compensation versus territorial ranching community fees. It's not even comparable." "I know. I ran the numbers 6 different ways trying to make them tell me Denver was the logical choice." Sarah smiled, and it was pure Evelyn, sharp, determined, slightly defiant. But logic doesn't account for everything. Some decisions require choosing meaning over money. Silas caught Evelyn's expression, pride and concern and recognition all mixed together. This was their daughter, making the same choice her mother had made 15 years earlier, choosing community over career advancement, meaning over prestige. The parallel was impossible to miss. "If you're doing this because you think we expect it," Evelyn started, "I'm doing it because I want to. Because I've spent 4 years studying financial theory in classrooms while watching you apply it to actual problems that affect real people's lives. The classroom version is interesting. The application version matters." Sarah looked at both of them. "I want to build something that matters. Turns out I learned that from you." They set her up in the ranch office that winter, expanding the space to accommodate 2 full-time practices. Sarah dove into the work with ferocious enthusiasm, taking on cases Evelyn had been too busy to pursue, modernizing systems that had remained unchanged for years, building relationships with families across the territory who needed financial guidance but couldn't afford big city rates. Mother and daughter working together was either going to be spectacular or disastrous, Silas figured, possibly both simultaneously. It turned out to be complicated in exactly the ways family business always was. Sarah wanted to implement new systems immediately, while Evelyn preferred testing changes carefully. They argued about client intake procedures, documentation standards, fee structures, nearly everything that could be argued about. But they also collaborated brilliantly when cases required combined expertise, Sarah's innovative thinking complementing Evelyn's experience in ways that served clients better than either could alone. "They're going to kill each other or revolutionize territorial finance," James observed one evening, after a particularly heated argument about contract review methodology had echoed through the house. "I can't tell which." "Both," Silas said. "Definitely both." But watching them work together, watching Sarah push her mother to try new approaches while Evelyn kept Sarah grounded in practical reality, he saw the future taking shape. This was succession happening organically, not a sudden transfer of responsibility, but gradual evolution as the next generation's capabilities grew to meet expanding opportunities. James was doing the same thing with ranch operations. At 17, he was effectively managing day-to-day activities while Silas focused on strategic planning and major decisions. The boy had earned genuine respect from the hands, not through his parents' position, but through demonstrated competence and fair leadership. It was everything Silas and Evelyn had worked toward, building something sustainable that could outlast their direct involvement. But watching it actually happen felt different than planning for it. Each responsibility transferred was another acknowledgement that their time as primary operators was finite, that the ranch would continue beyond them in forms they could influence but not control. "We're getting old," Evelyn said one evening, finding Silas in the stable tending to horses that were themselves younger versions of animals he'd worked with decades ago. "Everything turned over eventually. You noticed that too? Hard to miss when your daughter is doing your job better than you did at her age, and your son is running operations you still think of as your responsibility." She leaned against a stall door. "I thought I'd be ready for this transition. Thought I'd want to step back, enjoy reduced responsibility, let the next generation take over. Turns out, I'm not particularly good at letting go." "Me neither." Keep catching myself about to override James's decisions before remembering he's actually making good calls that don't need my interference. We built something meant to outlast us. Apparently that means actually letting it outlast us instead of clinging to control until we're too old to function. Silas finished with the horse moving to stand beside her. Scary thought. Terrifying, but also necessary. She took his hand, fingers threading through his with familiar ease. "We've got good years left, Silas. Years where we can still contribute and guide and be useful, but we also need to start thinking about what comes after, not in abstract future terms, but in practical transition planning." "You've been thinking about this." "Of course I have. It's what I do. Plan for contingencies, create systems that survive individual involvement, ensure continuity regardless of personnel changes." She squeezed his hand. "The ranch needs that same systematic approach. Clear succession plans, documented decision-making processes, financial structures that protect the operation's stability as leadership transitions." "That's a lot of work." "It is. But it's important work. And honestly, I think I'm better suited to planning our own succession than actually executing someone else's operations at this point." She met his eyes. "I want to build the framework that lets Sarah and James succeed, rather than trying to maintain control until I literally can't anymore." It was vintage Evelyn, turning emotional difficulty into practical problem-solving, applying analytical skills to personal challenges. But she was also right. They'd spent years building this operation, and ensuring it survived their eventual absence was part of that responsibility. They spent the next year creating what Evelyn called succession architecture, formal documentation of how the ranch and auditing practice should function, decision-making frameworks that would guide future operations, financial structures that protected against any individual person's poor judgment. Sarah and James were involved throughout, learning not just how to do their parents' jobs, but why certain approaches worked better than others. It was tedious, occasionally frustrating work that required confronting mortality and limitations neither wanted to acknowledge. But it was also weirdly satisfying, watching their accumulated knowledge get translated into systems that could teach future generations. "We're creating an instruction manual for our lives," Silas observed one evening, reviewing documentation that covered everything from water rights management to client relationship protocols. "Better than leaving them to figure it out through trial and error like we did," Evelyn replied. "Though they'll still make plenty of mistakes. That's unavoidable." "You almost sound like you're okay with that." "I am, actually. Mistakes are how you learn what actually matters versus what you thought mattered. Sarah and James will make different mistakes than we did, and they'll learn different lessons. That's growth, not failure." It was one of those observations that seemed obvious once stated but represented real evolution in Evelyn's thinking. The woman who'd arrived on the stagecoach would never have accepted mistakes as learning opportunities. She'd have seen them as evidence of inadequate preparation or flawed methodology. But 15 years of partnership, parenting, and community building had taught her that perfection wasn't achievable and usually wasn't even desirable. The real goal was resilience. Building something strong enough to survive mistakes, flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, grounded enough in solid principles that temporary failures didn't compromise the whole structure. They'd built that in the ranch, in their marriage, in the community systems they'd created. Now they were documenting it so the next generation could maintain and improve instead of having to recreate from scratch. Marcus died that spring, peacefully in his sleep at 73. The funeral drew people from across 3 territories: ranch hands he'd trained, families he'd helped, neighbors who'd relied on his steady competence and dry wisdom for decades. Silas gave the eulogy, talking about loyalty and friendship and the difference between working for someone versus building something together. But it was Evelyn who captured Marcus's essence in a story. "When I first arrived at this ranch," she told the assembled crowd, "Marcus was the one who prepared my cabin, cleaned it himself, made sure I had what I needed, treated my presence as normal instead of an intrusion. He did that because Silas asked him to, but also because that's who Marcus was, someone who took care of people without making a performance of it. This territory lost one of its finest men. We lost family." They buried him in the small cemetery that had grown up near the clinic, alongside James the Elder and others who'd built this community from nothing. Silas stood at the grave thinking about how many people he'd lost over the years: parents, brother, friends, now Marcus. Each loss carved out space inside him that never quite filled back in. But he also thought about what remained. Evelyn beside him, their children grown into capable adults, a community that functioned because people like Marcus had dedicated their lives to building it properly. Loss was inevitable, but so was continuity if you built something worth continuing. "We should visit more often," Evelyn said as they walked back to the wagon. "While we still can. These graves are reminders that time doesn't wait for convenient moments." Morbid thought. Practical one. "I'm 56 years old, Silas. You're 62. We're not ancient, but we're not young either. The time we have left to shape what comes next is finite." She was right, of course. They'd both slowed down over the past few years. Silas's knees complained about long days in the saddle. Evelyn's eyes tired faster when reviewing detailed accounts. Small changes that added up to the reality of aging bodies and limited remaining time. "So what do you want to do with that finite time?" he asked. "I want to make sure Sarah and James are genuinely ready, not just capable. I want to see grandchildren, if they choose to have them. I want to visit places we never got to because we were too busy building this." She paused. "And I want time with you that isn't defined by ranch emergencies or community crises or children needing guidance. Just us, remembering why we chose this life together." That sounds good? It does. So let's actually do it instead of just talking about it. They started small. Day trips to places they'd never visited despite living in the territory for decades. Evening rides that weren't about checking fence lines but just enjoying the land they'd worked so hard to maintain. Mornings spent on the porch with coffee and conversation instead of immediately diving into work. Sarah and James stepped up, handling responsibilities their parents gradually released. There were growing pains. Decisions Silas would have made differently, approaches Evelyn questioned before biting her tongue and letting Sarah learn through experience. But overall, the transition worked because they'd prepared for it instead of having it forced by crisis. 2 years after Marcus's death, Sarah married a lawyer from the territorial capital who'd worked with her on a complex fraud case. The wedding was at the ranch, naturally, with half the territory in attendance. Evelyn cried during the ceremony, which surprised everyone, including herself. "I'm not a crier," she protested afterward. "You are now, apparently," Silas said, amused and touched in equal measure. "Welcome to having emotions that overwhelm analytical control." "I've always had emotions. I just usually manage them better." Maybe managing them wasn't actually the goal. Maybe feeling them fully is. She considered this, watching Sarah dance with her new husband surrounded by celebrating community. When did you become wise? About the same time you became sentimental. We're both changing in our old age. We're not old. We're not young. That's different from old, but also different from what we were. It was true. They'd both softened over the years, the hard edges worn down by time and partnership and the constant work of choosing connection over protection. The people they'd been when they met, defended, isolated, certain they knew what they needed, wouldn't recognize the people they'd become. But the people they'd become were infinitely better versions, less perfect, more human, shaped by love and loss and the accumulated weight of years spent building something larger than individual survival. James married at 23, a practical woman from a neighboring ranch who understood livestock and land management and had no patience for romantic nonsense. She fit into ranch operations seamlessly, bringing her own expertise and opinions that improved how they worked. She and James ran the ranch together as genuine partners, implementing changes Silas would never have considered, but that demonstrably improved efficiency and profitability. "They're better at this than we were," Silas admitted one evening, reviewing operation reports that showed innovations he didn't fully understand but couldn't argue with the results. "They should be. They learned from our mistakes and built on our successes." Evelyn closed her own reports. Sarah's auditing practice had expanded beyond anything she'd achieved alone, serving clients across 5 territories with a reputation for brilliant analysis and fierce advocacy. That's the point of raising competent children. They surpass you. Still feels weird. It does, but it's good weird. Grandchildren arrived in due time. Sarah's son, sharp and curious and determined to understand how everything worked. James's daughter, quiet and observant with an uncanny ability to read people's unspoken thoughts. More followed, the ranch filling with young voices and endless questions, and the particular chaos that came with small humans learning to navigate the world. Silas discovered he was better at grandparenting than he'd been at parenting. The pressure was different. He could spoil them and teach them and send them back to their parents when they got difficult. But he also found genuine joy in watching them explore the ranch, seeing the land through eyes that found wonder in things he'd taken for granted for decades. Evelyn taught them arithmetic and financial literacy, starting younger than anyone thought appropriate, but producing children who understood money and value and the difference between price and worth before they were 10. She was patient with their questions, encouraging of their curiosity, delighted by their attempts to outcalculate her. "You're good at this," Silas observed, watching her explain compound interest to an 8-year-old using examples involving horses and breeding fees. "I have practice now. Wasn't good at it with Sarah and James, too worried about doing it wrong, too focused on preparing them for future challenges instead of enjoying present moments." She smiled as the child successfully completed a calculation. But grandchildren give you a second chance to get it right. The ranch continued prospering under James and his wife's management. They expanded carefully, invested wisely, maintained the community relationships that had always defined the operation. Sarah's practice grew into a regional firm with a reputation for taking on cases larger operations wouldn't touch: fraud against vulnerable populations, contract disputes where power imbalances favored the wealthy, financial crimes that required brilliant analysis to expose. She won more than she lost, and the wins mattered in ways that transcended money. "You built something significant," Silas told Evelyn one evening as they reviewed Sarah's latest case summary, a victory against a railroad company that had been systematically underpaying land acquisition prices for a decade. "Changed how an entire region approaches financial justice. We built it. You, me, Sarah, everyone who contributed to creating systems where fraud gets exposed instead of hidden." She set down the papers. "But yes, it feels good. Better than I expected when I stepped off that stagecoach planning to spend 3 weeks auditing a struggling ranch. Speaking of that day, anniversary's coming up again. 22 years since you arrived and broke all my rules before lunch. 22 years since you hired me, despite every instinct telling you to send me back to Boston." She leaned into him, comfortable and easy. Best worst decision either of us made.
Second best, agreeing to try when you wanted to leave was the actual best. Fair point.
They sat in the office where it had all begun, surrounded by 22 years of accumulated records and memories. The space had transformed over the decades, file cabinets replacing stacks of loose papers, proper lighting instead of inadequate lamps, 2 desks now instead of 1 because Sarah worked here as often as her mother. But the fundamental purpose remained the same. This was where numbers told stories about people's lives, where financial analysis served justice instead of just profit, where careful documentation protected those who couldn't protect themselves. This was where Evelyn had discovered that her skills mattered most when connected to actual human impact, where Silas had learned that partnership meant trusting someone else's expertise even when it challenged his assumptions, where they'd both figured out that building something meaningful required vulnerability they'd spent years avoiding. No regrets? Silas asked, the same question he'd posed periodically over the years. About what specifically? The same response, ritual and reassurance combined. All of it. Staying, building this life, choosing partnership over independence. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, actually considering instead of just deflecting. I regret the years I wasted being afraid of exactly this. I regret the time it took me to understand that self-sufficiency isn't the same as strength. I regret not meeting you 10 years earlier when we both had more energy and fewer scars. She turned to face him. But I don't regret a single day since I decided to stay. Even the hard ones, even the fights, even the moments when I was terrified we'd fail. All of it mattered because we built something real instead of just safe. That's the longest answer you've ever given to that question. I'm getting sentimental in my old age. You said so yourself. Not complaining. They sat together as evening settled into night. 2 people who'd spent more than 2 decades learning how to build a life together. It hadn't been easy. Partnership never was when both people were strong-willed and independent and carrying their own damage. But they'd chosen to keep trying even when easier options existed, and that choice had made all the difference.
On Silas's 70th birthday, the family threw a party that turned into something between celebration and community gathering. People came from across the territory. Families they'd helped during the land fraud case, clients Sarah had represented, neighboring ranchers who'd benefited from their water rights advocacy, former ranch hands who'd learned their trade at Crowley Ranch.
The stories told that night painted a picture of impact Silas hadn't fully recognized while living it. The Johnson family talked about how Evelyn's financial guidance had helped them weather drought and build prosperity. Dr. Chen described how the clinic they'd established had saved countless lives over 2 decades. Young auditors Sarah had trained spoke about learning to serve justice instead of just wealthy clients. You changed things, Carl Mitchell's son told Silas, now managing the property his father had almost lost to fraud. Not just for your own benefit, but for everyone. That matters more than you probably realize. Later, when the crowd had dispersed and only family remained, Sarah raised a glass. To my parents, who accidentally revolutionized territorial finance, community health care, and water rights law while thinking they were just running a ranch and doing some auditing on the side. We weren't trying to revolutionize anything, Evelyn protested. We were just solving problems as they appeared. That's how revolution actually happens, James said. Not through grand plans, but through consistent effort toward making things better. You taught us that. Silas looked around at his children, their spouses, the grandchildren who'd already fallen asleep in corners despite the celebration. This was what he and Evelyn had built. Not just prosperity or reputation, but family and community and systems that would outlast them both. We did all right, he said quietly. We did better than all right, Evelyn corrected. We built something that matters. 5 years later, Silas's health started failing. Not dramatically, no sudden crisis or emergency, just the slow erosion of a body that had worked hard for 75 years and was tired of the effort. His knees finally gave out completely, making walking difficult and riding impossible. His heart developed an irregular rhythm that left him exhausted by simple tasks. He fought it at first, stubborn pride insisting he could still manage ranch work if he just pushed harder. But Evelyn sat him down one evening with the kind of serious expression that meant this wasn't a discussion, but a confrontation. You're hurting yourself trying to prove you're not aging. That's stupid, and I didn't marry a stupid man. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just trying to stay useful. You're useful because of what you know and who you are, not because you can still physically work cattle at 75. James doesn't need you doing ranch hand labor. He needs your experience and judgment when difficult decisions arise. That's different from pretending your body isn't failing. The bluntness stung, but it was also classic Evelyn. No softening of difficult truths, no pretending reality was something other than what it was. Just honest assessment delivered with the expectation that he'd be strong enough to handle it. I don't know how to just advise, he admitted. I've been doing the actual work my entire life. Then learn, same as you learned everything else that mattered, by trying, failing, adjusting, and trying again. She took his hand. We're entering the final phase, Silas. The part where we step back and let what we built function without us. That doesn't mean we're useless. It means our usefulness takes different forms. He spent the next year learning to be advisor instead of operator. Sitting with James during difficult decisions, explaining the reasoning behind approaches that had worked, listening when the younger man's ideas diverged from his own experience. It was harder than any physical labor he'd ever done, holding back opinions, trusting others' judgment, accepting that the ranch would continue evolving in directions he couldn't control. But it was also liberating in unexpected ways. Without the burden of daily operations, he had time to actually observe, to notice how well James and his wife worked together, how competent the hands had become under their leadership, how the systems he and Evelyn had built functioned smoothly even without their constant involvement. They'd succeeded. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, not because they'd held on until the last possible moment, but because they'd built something sustainable and taught the next generation to maintain it. Evelyn's health stayed better longer, but at 68 her eyes finally gave up on detailed financial work. She could still review major cases, still provide strategic guidance to Sarah's practice, but the hours of close analysis that had defined her career became impossible. This is what obsolescence feels like, she said, frustrated after struggling through documents she once would have processed easily. This is what succession feels like, Silas corrected. Sarah doesn't need you doing the detailed work anymore. She needs your strategic thinking, your experience with complex cases, your reputation that opens doors. That's different from being obsolete. When did you become the wise one in this relationship? About the time you started admitting you couldn't do everything yourself. We're both learning. They settled into a rhythm that worked for their limitations. Mornings on the porch with coffee, watching the ranch wake up under other people's management. Afternoons with grandchildren, teaching them things that didn't require physical capability or perfect vision. Evenings together, talking about the lives they'd built and the time they had remaining. I'm grateful, Evelyn said one night, unprompted. For all of it. For you. For this life. For the sheer unlikely chance that I stepped off a stagecoach into exactly what I needed, even though I didn't know I needed it. Me too. We got lucky, Silas. Two damaged people finding each other at exactly the right moment, both stubborn enough to keep trying when easier options existed. That's rare. It is. But I think we also made our own luck by choosing to build something instead of just protecting ourselves. He pulled her closer. Luck got us started. Choice kept us going. In their final years together, Silas made it to 79, Evelyn to 73, they watched the ranch continue evolving. James's children were old enough to start learning operations, showing the same natural competence their father had demonstrated. Sarah's firm had expanded to 3 full-time auditors serving the entire territorial region, with a reputation for taking on cases no one else would touch. The clinic they'd established had become a full medical center, serving thousands of families with quality care that would have been impossible a generation earlier. The water rights precedent they'd fought for protected dozens of communities from predatory acquisition. The financial systems Evelyn had implemented had become standard practice across the territory, making fraud harder and justice more accessible. They'd changed things, not through grand design or deliberate revolution, but through consistent effort toward making their corner of the world function better, through choosing community over isolation, partnership over independence, building together over the safety of staying separate. These were the lessons they'd learned and taught their children, who were teaching them to the next generation. That real strength came from admitting you needed help. That meaningful safety required vulnerability, not walls. That the most important work was often serving others instead of protecting yourself. On a June morning 27 years after Evelyn had first arrived, Silas died peacefully in his sleep. She found him when she woke, looking calm and finally free from the pain his failing body had caused. She sat with him for a while, holding his hand and thinking about everything they'd built together. Then she called the family, made the practical arrangements, and planned a funeral that celebrated his life instead of just mourning his death. The turnout was massive, 3 territories worth of people whose lives had been touched by Silas Crowley, the rancher who'd fought for community water rights, who'd stood up to land fraud, who'd built something that served more than just himself. They told stories about his fairness, his integrity, his willingness to help neighbors, even when it cost him personally. But it was James who captured his father's essence in the eulogy. "My dad didn't set out to change the world. He just set out to do things right, treat people fairly, build something sustainable, serve the community that sustained him. He taught me that greatness isn't about grand achievements, but about consistent integrity in everything you do. That the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you build for others." Evelyn sat in the front row with her children and grandchildren surrounding her, crying openly because she'd finally learned that managing emotions wasn't always the goal. Sometimes feeling them fully, the grief and gratitude and love, was exactly what the moment required. They buried him next to his brother James in the cemetery near the clinic, the plot Evelyn had purchased years earlier for both of them. She stood at the grave after everyone else had left, saying goodbye to her partner of 27 years. "We did good," she told him quietly. "Built something real that outlasted our mistakes and served people beyond ourselves. Thank you for being stubborn enough to ask me to stay, and patient enough to teach me that partnership was better than independence." She lived 4 more years, staying active in Sarah's practice when her health allowed, spending time with grandchildren who were already showing signs of inheriting the family's particular blend of analytical skill and social conscience. She documented everything she knew about the cases she'd handled, the systems she'd built, the lessons she'd learned, creating knowledge transfer that would serve future generations. On June 14th, the anniversary of her arrival, Sarah found her mother at the ranch gate where Silas had spent so many mornings watching the sunrise and remembering. Evelyn was reading his journal, entries from that first year when they'd both been terrified and stubborn, and slowly learning to build something together. "You all right, Mama? I'm remembering all of it, the fear, the fights, the moments when we almost gave up because staying seemed too hard. And I'm grateful we didn't." She closed the journal. "Your father and I were both so certain we knew what we needed when we met. Both completely wrong, but stubborn enough to learn better. What did you need?" "Each other. Partnership that challenged us instead of comfortable isolation. Purpose that connected our skills to actual human impact instead of just abstract achievements." She looked at the ranch spread out in morning light. "We needed to build something that mattered more than our individual survival. This is what that looks like." Evelyn died peacefully 6 months later, surrounded by family in the house she'd shared with Silas for nearly 3 decades. Her last words were characteristically practical, reminding Sarah about a client deadline and telling James where to find updated succession documentation. But her last thought, the one she carried into whatever came next, was gratitude. For the stagecoach that had delivered her to this place, for the stubborn rancher who'd asked her to stay, for the life they'd built that proved safety and meaning weren't opposites, but could be woven together into something stronger than either alone. They buried her next to Silas, reuniting partners who'd spent nearly 30 years learning that the best things in life required the courage to be vulnerable, the strength to stay when leaving seemed safer, and the wisdom to build together instead of surviving alone. The ranch continued as they'd designed it to. James and his children, Sarah and her practice, grandchildren growing into their own versions of competence and conscience. The systems held because they'd been built to outlast individual involvement, to serve purposes larger than any one person's lifetime. This was the legacy. Not just land or money or reputation, but proof that 2 damaged people choosing partnership over protection could build something that served communities for generations. That meaningful work came from connecting skills to human impact rather than just pursuing abstract achievement. That real safety required the courage to be vulnerable instead of the comfort of staying defended. On June 14th each year, the family gathered at the ranch gate at sunrise. It had become tradition, remembering the morning Evelyn Hart had stepped off a stagecoach and changed everything, not through grand design, but through consistent choice toward building something better than what existed before. The ranch spread out around them in morning light, prosperous and sustainable, and serving purposes its founders had barely imagined. This was what happened when people chose courage over comfort, partnership over independence, building together over the safety of staying separate. This was what love looked like when it was practical instead of just romantic, when it served communities instead of just individuals, when it was measured in systems built and lives improved rather than perfect moments preserved. This was what they'd created together, two stubborn people learning that the best things in life came from the courage to try, the strength to stay, and the wisdom to build something larger than themselves. The sun rose over Crowley Ranch like it had for generations, like it would for generations more. And in that perpetual light, their legacy lived on. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and meaningful and built to last.